If you're new to the space, which looking at the crowd, I think we're almost all regulars, but if you're new to the space, we cover news here. We use lots of mainstream sources, but then we try to heavily accent those with open source reporting, mainly from great accounts here on Twitter. In addition to covering the news, we try to cover some tools and techniques for doing open source analysis. Whether you're new to it or you've been at it for a while, hopefully everybody can bring their skill level up. We also try to invite friends of ours to give presentations, or we do interviews of people who are doing good work. In that way, hopefully, you can be introduced to projects that may catch your interest, and it will create opportunities for collaboration to build the community up further. This space relies pretty heavily on use of the nest, which is the window at the top of the space, where links to individual tweets, I'm still going to call them tweets, are placed. If you were to scroll all the way to the right-hand side of the nest, you'll see that first item is the invitation to tonight's space. If you were to click on that, you'll see the thread below it contains the agenda, the speaking notes. And the reason I do that is so that you don't have to take my word for the things I'm presenting to you. I try to provide sources for just about everything I'll speak to. It also allows that if you're interested in something, you can take that as a launching point for further reading. If you do have a look at the materials there, you can look ahead. Hopefully you develop questions or comments based on them, and we'd love you to come up and speak with us. To do that, you can hit the request microphone button. It's in the bottom left-hand corner of the Spaces window. And I know that I set an agenda and that we try to work through it, but I really do invite conversation. The reason I set the agenda is so that we have, at least a minimum standard of content to work through, so that we don't have dead air. But a lot of it is intended to inspire conversation. If you're enjoying our discussion as we go along, I do invite you to share it out with others, retweet it. You can do that by hitting the button in the bottom left corner of the Spaces window. I think that's it for background. In terms of timing for tonight, we don't have a particular guest, so we're going to just run through news. Those of you who have attended regularly will know that I was off on vacation this last weekend. We did not hold our Sunday space, so there might be a little bit more to catch up on tonight, which is fine. Lots of interesting news in the last week. We do hold these conversations every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. That one a little bit earlier, hoping we can catch our European friends sort of as they are just getting ready for bed. And to that end, so starting from the right-hand side of the nest, the first item is the invite to tonight's space, but that item always stays there, so you can always get to the agenda by going all the way back to the right. The second item from the right is an invitation to Sunday's space, so our next conversation. You can set your reminder now. The third item is, for those who may not know, we have friends of ours. They run a YouTube account called OSINT-TV, and they're live streaming this conversation. So there's actually video. Our friends have gotten pretty sophisticated. They can put the screen captures of the various tweets we have in the nest up on the video. It's a pretty slick presentation. I'd encourage you to participate here on Twitter so that you can speak with us. But if you ever miss a conversation, you can go back to the YouTube account and catch up. The fourth item from the right includes our, I'll call it our community calendar. In the image you'll see, because we've started the month of August, it's pretty bare at the moment. But we started it in order to coordinate hosting of spaces for those who are doing spaces on Ukraine or OSINT-related spaces, so our friends at Touchny, for example. And then to that, we add interesting outside events from universities and think tanks, whether it's related to the war in Ukraine or to OSINT more broadly. If you open up the link in your web browser, you'll get a calendar. Each calendar entry will generally either have a registration for upcoming events or usually a recording to past events. If you guys have any events you'd like to have added to the calendar, then please let me know, or you could let my, she will be a co-host again soon, co-host Jacoby know. Or I don't know if Planet Baroque is with us, but if Planet is here, she does the majority of the calendar updating, so you can let us know. And we actually had a couple of tips from folks in the last week or so, which is helpful to keep eyes open. I will quickly highlight some upcoming events and some podcasts from the last week. There's an event coming up that I consider this more OSINT related. So I've put it as the first item in the left of the nest now. But it's a talk that's going to be held on August 15th, so a week and a half from today. And it is analyzing data points, trying to project where potential Chinese naval bases may be constructed. And I know we sometimes discuss maritime matters, and it's also drawing from the clues that suggest bases may be under development. So that may be an interesting talk, not only with regard to where bases may wind up, but also to the methods that they're using to feed their analysis. A lot of us have probably been following developments in Niger over the last week with the coup there, and then the ongoing, ultimatum from ECOWAS, that community of countries in West Africa, who are saying that if the coup is not reversed, they will take military action. We do have a bunch of material on that toward the bottom of our notes. If our friends who cover African developments arrive, I know they're in time zones where that's difficult, then we may move it up the calendar. But to that end, there was an interview held actually just prior to the coup with Simtac, who does great open source work here on Twitter, discussing how critical Niger's stability is to the broader region. So it's interesting to see his thoughts in hindsight. So I have just put that up in the front of the nest. There was another YouTube video put out by Good Times, Bad Times, who I've highlighted before. They often draw on analysis from Konrad Muzyka. In this case, they're talking about the deployment of additional Ukrainian reserves, the 10th Corps, and rumors that Russia had gathered 100,000 men on the Eastern Front. These are all matters that we spoke about a week ago. I guess it takes a while to get the videos into production, but if you had not been right up to date, you might find the video a helpful refresher. We also try to get into technical aspects sometimes. So there was actually a talk today. Hopefully at the link, there's now a recording. If it's not at that link, I'll try to follow up afterward and find if they put up a recording elsewhere. But it's a talk being held by the Association of Old Crows, who does a lot of work with radio and electronic systems. And this was a talk on the history of cognitive radar and electronic warfare. And I didn't have a chance to listen to the talk today, but the introduction explaining what the talk was about seemed pretty intriguing, so I thought I would highlight it to you guys. There was also a space held last night by our friend Sam Bendet, who does analysis of military drones, particularly Russian drones. He works with the Center for Naval Analysis. Our co-host Exit also co-hosted for Sam, and Michael Kaufman was his guest. It was a great talk, and so you can find the recording at the front of the nest. There was an interesting podcast done from the Lawfare account, which is pretty well known. And they did a podcast on introducing digital evidence into the courtroom, which is a matter that's of interest to me, and I suspect to many of you. It's a subject that Bellingcat has often written on. In this case, they're speaking with other experts, not Bellingcat experts, so it's nice to get some variety in opinion on the matter. And there were two last items. There was a new edition of the Russia contingency, and this was Michael Kaufman. So this is his podcast that's done in collaboration with War on the Rocks, but it's for subscribers only. So consider it maybe worth it to you. He had taken a trip to Ukraine, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, with some of his analyst friends, including Hon Solo and Konrad Muzyka. And this is essentially a debrief or discussion about the things that they saw while they were in Ukraine. As a last item, there was an interesting interview on the podcast done by Melania Podolyak, and they actually had on Jacob Janowski, or on Twitter, his account is Rebel44CZ, and he is one of the primary folks helping out Oryx in his project. And I've never seen Jacob interviewed before, so the topic sounded pretty interesting. Hopefully I'll have a chance to catch up on that in the next day or two. Okay, so that's it for the podcast and material. I like to highlight those so everybody can sort of stay up to date. There are a couple of interesting resources that came up in the last week. I'll put these up in the front of the nest, if you bear with me. The first of which is an interesting post from Le Monitor, or sorry, just one moment. From Le Monitor, or John Wiseman. He maintains a product or a project called GPS Jam, which monitors jamming of GPS signals by looking at where aircraft are having difficulty receiving them. And it's pretty helpful in tracking GPS jamming around the world. I don't know of very many other open source options for that tool. And in that post, he's talking about other features that he wants to add to it. But he's running into the interesting difficulty that I think many folks who do OSINT tools find, that they become time limited and they'd really love to continue their project, but they're financially constrained. And so he's just talking about thinking, how can he add the elements that he wants to, and what can he do to potentially start charging for different levels of feature sets. And so if any of you have used his tool, you can give him feedback on what his options are there. If you haven't used it, do go to his website and check it out. It's pretty cool. And I'll be interested to see how he works to solve this problem, because as we've seen a couple of different OSINT folks encounter how to make their hobby financially sustainable, we've seen different solutions. The second item in the nest is an article from the Washington Post, which just highlights that at the DEF CON conference for programming hacking that comes up shortly, there will be the reveal of a new framework. It's a sort of a programming framework that can be used to develop applications, which could include file transfer, messaging, potentially social networking. I believe it's called Valid, and apparently it's sort of from the ground up, built with encryption and security in mind. So that introduction will probably be interesting to folks in the OSINT space. And while this is a framework for developing the programming, I'm sure that we'll start to see some sort of homebrewed apps based on it pretty quickly after its release. The third item back is a part, I think it's an ongoing series on the Reporter's Guide to Investigating War Crimes. And in this case, they're discussing the principles and agreements that surround the use of various types of weapons. So if you want to come up the curve on that, have a look at that guide. I think it's mainly been developed by some folks who have a bunch of experience doing OSINT work in Syria. And so that's probably the primary context, but I suspect a lot of it could be applicable to Ukraine as well. Finally, in resources, just because we're in the midst of summer, somebody sent to me The U.S. Army Leadership Center had put out a summer reading list. I always find these lists of recommended books interesting, and thought you might like checking out what books on war they recommend. Okay, I do want to highlight a couple of cool examples of OSINT work from the last couple of days. So I'll put these items up. The first of which is a discussion about ordering satellite imagery from Sky-Fi, which I believe relies on the service provided by Umbra. And I know that there are several different satellite provider options to purchase imagery, but this is a walkthrough of the features of Sky-Fi. And I think Sky-Fi tends to be one of the more affordable of the options. Sorry, I'll pause in a moment. I know that Radio and Nukes is with us, so he may be able to highlight some differences between the different platforms and his experiences with Sky-Fi. But that item should have populated to the front of the nest by now. So I don't know, Radio and Nukes, this first post there is by the Radio Research Group. Do you tend to use Sky-Fi much, or do you rely on other sources for your imagery?
I have not used it yet. I'm actually looking at it right now. So maybe I can get back to you on this next time.
Okay. Well, that would be cool. I know that in the past when we've chatted about it, you've said that tasking satellites can be extremely expensive, so you tend to purchase imagery from archives. And this looks like one of the more affordable options in terms of fresh tasking. The second item back in the nest, as an example, is investigatory work done into attacks in the Darfur region of Sudan. As part of the ongoing, essentially civil war there. This has been done by the Center for Information Resilience, and they rely on everything from, firms to ground imagery to confirm the nature of those attacks. And I thought it was just a nice application of concepts we've seen elsewhere applied in Sudan. The third item back is a tweet from Chris Osiek, who does a lot of work with Bellingcat. And in this case, he worked with them on a project to do some open source investigation into Israeli raids into the Jenin refugee camp in the month of July. And they looked at a couple of different aspects there. If you were to look at Bellingcat's account, you can find their report. What I've highlighted is Chris's little mini thread on how to geolocate in somewhere like the Jenin refugee camps, where the streets aren't necessarily laid out in as regular a manner. There aren't necessarily as clear markings or street signs, but he has several suggestions for searching for news reports that may come from the camps, that may have photographs of the area that you can use as reference points. Which I thought was a great technique. So do check out Chris's suggestions for geolocating under those circumstances. You may be looking at similar things in the future. The fourth item back is a tweet from Daniel Van, and he is talking about OSINT work in Sudan. And I think it was a week and a half ago, when I included an appeal from the Sudan OSINT group, and they saw me include those materials in the agenda, and then they actually asked to come and speak. So they spoke with us for 3 or 4 minutes, just requesting that if anybody wants to do geolocation or assist in their project, to reach out to them. They mentioned that they were working with the Center for Advanced Defense and several others who are well-known OSINT groups, so they sound pretty legitimate. The reason I've put this fourth item up in the nest there is that in Daniel's tweet, he talks about a lot of the great accounts who are doing OSINT work, like he names them. And so if you weren't familiar with who some of the accounts are looking in this region, this is a helpful starting point, just to get familiar with some of the names and sources. The fifth item, back in the nest, last in this block, is a tweet from Pasi Peroinen. And so Pasi is a member of the Blackbird group, which is a new OSINT group formed about 2 months ago, who do some interesting work and analysis. One of their very first threads was this long thread he's quote tweeted about development of Russian fortifications. And what he has done in this tweet that I've highlighted now is decided to release all of the satellite images that they used to do the work behind the thread. And so not only may those satellite images be helpful to you as fighting may be approaching some of these defensive positions, but also in this thread, he goes into some of the techniques that they used in order to analyze the imagery themselves to draw their conclusions. So you might like seeing some of the way that they worked through the initial analysis. I have one more block of interesting examples, and then we'll get into updates from Ukraine. If you just bear with me, I'm putting these up quickly in the nest. So the first of these, which will appear in just a moment, is from GeoConfirmed, and it's a bit of a cautionary story where some footage was going around appearing to show the deployment of floating fences. And this was about a week after the most recent attack on the Kerch Bridge. And so there were claims that this floating fencing was put in place to shut off essentially the Kerch Strait. And it turns out that it was just mislabeled, and it's not clear where the error in communication came in, but many accounts did come out and repeat that it was in the Kerch Strait, when it turns out that the fencing was actually deployed by the port in Sevastopol. And GeoConfirmed corrected that. And so it's just a cautionary tale not to believe everything that you see.
Hey, Mr. Bond?
Yeah.
You have a little bit of a glitch there.
Okay, if you bear with me, I'll be back in about 10 seconds.
Thank you. I believe they figured out, GeoConfirmed, if you look at that particular post, they noted that was in Sevastopol. It was an older post. Radio Nukes, you had something?
I just want, if you're going to look at stuff like that, be sure to pay attention to the current vegetation. If you're going to, you can always pull up Sentinel-2 from the EO browser. It's openly available. Look what the current ground, if it's brown and dry or green and lush, just have a look at that before you start anything like that, because that would have given that one away. I had looked at this one, and it didn't look right from the get-go.
Radio Nukes, was that, am I correct that was footage that they said was from last October, or it looked like it was from last October?
I didn't see the conclusion, but it obviously wasn't Kerch, because I had been watching Kerch real closely lately, and Kerch is pretty low on rainfall in that area, and it's fairly dry late summer kind of vegetation, and it just didn't match the current situation in the timeline. And I hadn't seen what their conclusion of where it was and when, but it certainly looked a lot more like Sevastopol to me.
Hey guys, thanks for being patient there. I'm back. Glad you had a moment for a back and forth. So to keep running through some of these good examples, it'll just take another 2 minutes, and then we'll move on to the updates. So the second item back in the nest, sometimes I talk about the philosophy of OSINT, and these are two examples of highlighting that OSINT is just a tool. It's a set of methods or software tools, and that its use can be either good or bad depending on the intent of the person using it. So that second item back notes that apparently the Russian military blogger Rybar is going to begin teaching OSINT methods at a Russian university. So it's really interesting that they're embracing it openly in this way to make use of it. A little, in a way related, the third item back in the nest is a tweet from Elliot Higgins. And this is a link to an article in The Intercept about the use of OSINT tools, including some fairly sophisticated ones, in order to investigate possible human trafficking. But there are allegations that the investigations are being used more for social purposes or political ends than they are really to highlight victims of trafficking. And there are complicating factors in it because apparently several of the folks who participate in this work are either recent military law enforcement, and some of them apparently are still acting law enforcement, and therefore have access to some particularly sophisticated tools. And so I found it a fascinating story about the ways that even without necessarily really bad intent, use of OSINT can be used, or misapplied, perhaps, in its purpose. So you guys might find that story interesting. The fourth item back is a bit of an update. It's not exactly OSINT work, but our friend Language Learner has come to speak with us several times about the work that he is doing in Ukraine to train folks there, Ukrainian soldiers, on tactical combat casualty care. And we had helped him out a bit. We had highlighted some materials, some training materials he had translated into Ukrainian and then posted on a Telegram channel. And he keeps getting great feedback from the Ukrainian soldiers who he's trained about how they've applied his training and in many cases saved lives. So I just wanted to highlight that as a big win. Finally, occasionally folks among us will put out sort of a call for assistance. And so the fifth item back is a tweet by Al Mustek, who works with Oryx and several others. And he explained that he's trying to undertake a project to look at the use of trucks, both by the Russians and the Ukrainians, to get a sense of the range of truck types used and also which are the most common, right down to pickups. And he put out a call for, hey, can you please send me or tag me in as many pictures and videos of cars, vans, pickups, and so on as you can find. And interestingly, his request didn't get a lot of attention. I think he got one retweet from me. And so I'm putting it to you guys. There's tons of footage of these types of vehicles that he could be tagged in. So if you have some extra time, maybe you can help him advance his project. Okay, so that's it for the background. We'll get into updates at this point. As usual, I will just note that there are lots of folks who do amazing work at mapping. And, over the last week, I don't think there have been significant advances along the front line, but I do know that the volume of material, video evidence of fighting and small changes has been significant. I know that Andrew Perpetua had tweeted out about how it was one of his busiest days ever in analyzing a bunch of footage that became available. And so folks like Andrew do terrific and specialized work. I'd encourage you to check out their maps. So what I've put in the nest is a collection of some of the best maps. And so in that, I've included the maps from the Institute for the Study of War, War Mapper, Andrew Perpetua, DEFMON, Project OWL, Poulet Volant, Deep State, Geo-confirmed. And then I've also included, I thought I included, normally I do, David Helm's weather update, which is sort of relevant to the understanding as well. I include all of these because they have slightly different approaches. Some of them will try to map units, others don't. Some of them will prepare versions that show recent changes in control. Others just do sort of a live version, running version. So do check out Compare and Contrast. As a usual reminder, our friend Andrew Perpetua does a YouTube live stream twice a week where he does a screen share of his map, and he actually walks through the changes on the screen and then describes the thinking that led him to make the changes. And so those talks are Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and Friday afternoons at, is it 3 p.m. Eastern Time, I believe. So you can check out Andrew Perpetua's account on YouTube to see those presentations. Okay, so I'll start putting some of the material on the offensive up. I may have missed one set of material that I wanted to speak to, that it was maybe a little bit more philosophical, but 4 or 5 days ago, the New York Times put out an article that talked about Ukraine undertaking a change in strategy and suggesting that they may have abandoned an approach that was more driven by their NATO allies training over the last few years, and that they perhaps had returned more toward a strategy of attrition in order to diminish the Russians before potentially having an opportunity to move back toward more of a mobile strategy. And that led to a lot of debate over the last few days, with lots of people pointing out, for example, that it's difficult for Ukraine to carry out a combined arms strategy without significant air power, as most NATO countries would be relying on. And I know I'm only speaking to it because I missed including these 2 or 3 links. But then as that debate continued, I believe his name is Samuel Friedman. He runs a Substack. If I find these links, I'll put them up in a moment. But he suggested that really there needs to be a move away conceptually from the idea of mobility versus attrition, and that it really has to be sort of its own hybrid thing in Ukraine, and that shouldn't be the focus. And then sort of capping off the debate on theory, there was a post from Rob Lee, who I don't think intended this comment exactly in the context of the discussion prompted by the New York Times article. But he was saying that it seemed like for the last few weeks that Ukraine had really been engaging in an infantry level fight, which I had heard. Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, great. So sorry. It looks like my co-hosts may be pulling these up. So if you guys are able to add those to the nest, that would be terrific. But Rob Lee was saying that Ukraine had entered into an infantry level fight. And I've heard separate analysis suggesting that reliance on infantry really became necessary because of the density of minefields. But he was saying that after having fought that way for a few weeks, it seems like in the last few days, Ukraine has once again attempted a couple of pushes with armor. But he said, and I take this as a little bit doubtful from Rob, that he doesn't know whether there's been sufficient Russian attrition to achieve a breakthrough. And so that particular item led to a whole bunch of interesting discussion in the replies to the thread. So big thanks to my co-hosts for putting the material up in the nest. So you can see Rob Lee's thread on that, for example, is the first item up at the moment. So you might want to save that for later and go back and look at the debates in the replies about, the role of tanks, what's the value of armor at the moment. Lots of people talking about, it's totally to be expected that this has to be a slow attritional fight without air power. Many of the themes we've talked about in the last few weeks. Anyway, I had wanted to highlight that sort of back and forth on what strategy is Ukraine pursuing at the moment. It does seem like a lot of the better analysts are agreeing that it is an attrition-heavy fight, that Ukraine is focusing on the destruction of Russian artillery at the moment, and that they really seem to be just trying to slowly work their way through into the main defensive lines and biding their time with an artillery fight and infantry advances before they commit to a bigger push. So I'm now working a ways back, and again, if anybody has any thoughts on these back and forth ideas about whether you think the maneuver versus attrition, is it actually a dichotomy? Should Ukraine be adopting a hybrid approach, and so on? I welcome any comments. I know it may take you a little while to form your comments, so I'm happy to jump back at any time. I will keep going through updates though until we get some people who want to jump in. So I'm working a ways back in the nest now. I'm on the 5th item back. I wanted to note that Ukraine is continuing its effort to undercut Russian logistics chains. And so this tweet, it's from the account, the team of Zina Portnova. This is one of the first accounts that put out an image of the rail bridge near Shonhar. And the road bridge had been struck several weeks ago. The Russians had then built a small pontoon bridge, but the rail bridge had remained intact until just a few days ago. And so I believe it was struck on Friday, and it took a little bit of time to get imagery of the strike. You can see here that it appears to have significantly damaged the rail bed, but I saw some debate over whether this was on the bridge portion or whether it was sort of just at the point where it meets the land, and therefore what the implications would be for the rate of repair. But anyway, it is a development in the right direction and shows Ukraine is still working to try to undercut Russian logistics. I'll pause for hands. Do you want to go ahead, Wolknik?
Thank you. Yeah, just really quick. You kind of said, until people want to jump in. So there was something I wanted to mention. I couldn't put in the comments because they're not available, at least on my end. So I retweeted the space and attached it. But it's a big boom at the, and I came late, like I said, so I don't know if you brought it up. Oxygen battery warehouse near the Moscow region. Have you heard of it? Is it new to you? And yeah, I just wanted to bring it to your attention.
Sure, we hadn't discussed it. Is that something that's just happened in the last hour or two?
Few hours.
Yeah.
Kind of like
Okay.
breaking-ish, yeah.
Okay. Well, that's, deep strikes are part of their overall strategy. So thanks for bringing that to our attention.
Yeah,
I'm sure
it's pretty impressive. It's huge.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are some among us who will be fast at work on geolocation, and hopefully in the next day or so, some of our friends might try to pull down imagery to look at the battle damage.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining. Skate Park, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. The Russian media is saying that this was oxygen accumulator factory, so that means not a battery, but a medical device which pulls oxygen out of the air for people who need extra oxygen for breathing. I haven't verified that location, but that is a kind of a language quirk, because if you it sounds a lot like acid and oxygen sounds a bit like similar in in Russian, so it might sound like it's a lead acid battery, but accumulator factory, but it was actually a medical device factory, if the Russian media is correct. And going back to the other question about breakthroughs and attrition, one point I would make there is that as long as Ukraine is actually threatening a breakthrough by having ready reserves with engineering equipment and a lot of mobility enablers, the Russians are going to be very stressed about the threat of an armored breakthrough that could happen actually at any point along the front, at least from the Zaporizhzhia front and all the way up to the border. So that's one of the things which is like one of the operational themes here is that while the Ukrainians are treating the Russians also can't commit all their reserves because they know they have Ukrainian reserves with engineering and armor.
Yeah, that's a great point. When we spoke about a week ago, we had talked about some significant advances at that time, including the capture of Staromayorsk and some advances to the east, potentially even the southeast around Robotny. And I haven't heard about significant advances sort of on the Zaporizhzhia front since that time, but I think you are right that a breakthrough could potentially come at any moment through that first line. So we'll just have to keep our eyes on it closely. And so I'd encourage you to follow those folks who do that good mapping work, the maps that I highlighted. To continue with updates, but thanks for your comment, Skatepark. It's the seventh item back in the nest now. It's a tweet by Jeff. And this account does some pretty detailed work tracking both the provision of equipment and losses. And he does a tally, every couple of weeks, particularly on the loss of specific artillery systems. So this is his latest, showing that Russia in the last month has lost 91 total units of artillery. Which is a huge rate. And we've had some discussions in our spaces before about how it appears that Ukraine's goal really is to attrit the Russian artillery advantage. Our friend Nalcio, who works with Oryx, will occasionally put out a breakdown of losses of all types of vehicles, but just for the offensive. I haven't seen that in a couple of days since our last space. But when he's broken that down, he's able to show that Russian losses of artillery units appear to be running 3 to 4 times higher than the losses of Ukrainian artillery. And so it does seem like Ukraine's strategy of targeting artillery systems is working. I think it's now the 8th item back in the nest. I like collecting all of these efforts where people are trying to quantify different aspects of the offensive. And so that 8th item back is by Elizabeth Gosselin-Mallow, who's a defense journalist. And she recently wrote this article noting that if you compare the January to March period with the April through June period, the composition of the use of Russian missiles in attacks has really shifted, and that Russia seems to be relying a lot more on drones like the Shaheds, and using considerably less of the sophisticated missile types. Now, given this period runs, the second period there for comparison runs April to June, I do know that in the last month, there were reports of a lot more use of Bastion and Onyx and those types of missiles. And so the Russians may have temporarily gone back to using more expensive types, but that does seem to suggest that there's a gradual trend to diminishing stocks of the more advanced precision missiles. We'll go to exit and then we'll go to Skatepark.
I had heard somebody say this and I didn't get to ask questions about it earlier, but that Shaheds are more accurate potentially than some of the missiles they're using. Does anybody have information on whether that is true or not? I would be interested to hear it.
Well, that sounds to me like a question Colby might have insight into. I don't know if there is measurement or reporting of like the circular error probability of Shaheds in the same way you get for precision missiles, but Colby, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it depends on what missile you're comparing it to, I guess. Russia has some missiles that are quite accurate, and they have some that are not so accurate. So relative to something like Onyx is pretty accurate. Relative to the Russians using S-300 interceptors in a surface-to-surface role, Shahed is significantly more accurate compared to that. So it depends on which Russian missile system you want to compare it to.
Thanks for that. And I know that in a moment we'll get into how that error may be particularly significant in the Russia has begun.
Your mic is having a little issue. And while he's fixing his mic, just a quick reminder that if you can retweet the space, that would be great. You can retweet it using the button on the lower right-hand corner. You can also look to the nest. It would be the top, one back, in the nest. If you can retweet that out, that would be very helpful. If you wish to speak in the space, ask any questions, bring up any updates, please do request the mic on the lower left-hand corner of your phone. There's a little mic icon, just hit that, and we'll try and get you up. Exit.
So Colby, in regards to the Shaheds, the comment that I had heard was that that's specifically why they were using those on the Danube River ports areas, because they were more likely to be accurate than some of the other missiles that would be able to hit those specific port areas. And that kind of aligns with what you're saying there. But Skate Park, did you have something?
Yes, on that point, there were reports from the Ukrainians that the Shaheds also are able to fly more circuitous routes to the targets and maybe to be controlled in mid-air. I'm not sure if that has been verified by anyone, but the extent is even possible to do it. But one problem with this statistic is that the difference between a missile like the Ka-22 and the Ka-32 is that the Ka-22 is an anti-ship missile, which, if I understand correctly, is very inaccurate against ground targets. You're more likely to hit a city block area, maybe, with it, while the Ka-32 is more accurate, but they look like the same, so it's very hard to separate in the statistic. Does anyone know about statistics about Russian glide bomb uses? Because one of the things that they have been doing instead of using precision missiles or to make those last longer is to use glide bombing attacks. Do we have any data about that?
Sorry, my mic was caught there for a moment. I haven't seen any data on glide bomb use. I know I've seen a handful of reports that they have been used and that they've also been pictured under wing. So we know that they're being used. I just don't know if their use has been frequent enough or that it is readily distinguishable enough from other types of munitions that anybody started a statistical study of it. But Colby, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen quite a lot of pictures of the Russians putting glide kits on some of their older unguided munitions to try and get some more range out of them. I haven't seen any analysis about how really widespread that is, how effective it's been. I don't know that we would be able to get that sort of analysis because we're kind of at the mercy of whatever pictures the Russians choose to release publicly on Telegram about the ordnance that they're equipping on their aircraft. So it is happening, but I don't have anything on how effective that is, or if it's pervasive and that most bombs are getting those kits. I would suspect no, but guys like Guy Plopsky and some of the guys at Rusi that are paying close attention to Russian aircraft will probably be the ones that will have anything. If there is anything to report further, they'll be the ones that will have it.
Nukes, I saw your hand go up there for a sec.
Yeah, if anybody has a look at some of the pictures that have come out of the, I think it's the FAB 6000 glide bomb kit. There's more letters and numbers to the kit, but have a look at them and just use your own opinion. They look very one-off, or they're coming right out of the factory door. The welds aren't ground. You just have to have a look at them. I'll see if I can dig the tweet up so you can put it in the nest, but they look very much like one-offs almost. So just wanted to add 2 cents in there worth. And I do think that some of those would be distinguishable, especially those larger ones where they've got, 1,000 kilogram warheads or something to that amount. Those have been pretty noticeable when we've seen them used along the line of control. But as far as like in the ports and stuff, I don't know of any instances of that thus far. And I'll dig that tweet up in a second.
So Nukes, that's an interesting observation. Do you, what do you draw from it? Is it that just Russian manufacturing quality isn't all that high, or that they're sort of recently rushing to ramp up production of those kinds of kits? Do you make anything particular of it?
Gonna hit the button. I would say they're ramping up production to fill a need, and my guess would be quantity of other PGMs, but I don't have any information to back that up. That's pure speculation on my part, but I'll dig that tweet up. And if you look at those compared to something like a JDAM ER or something, there's no paint. They're freshly welded. You can still see the weld splatter. It's just worth having a look at.
Very interesting. Okay, I'll look forward to that. Okay, so the last item from this block, I'm just going to move it up to the front, if you'll bear with me, was a breakdown, sort of in the generally discussing the progress of the offensive where, so it should be in the front of the nest now. It's a tweet by War Mapper. And what he's done is created a graphic that shows the amount of Ukrainian territory that was held by Russia from the 2014 period prior to 2022. Then it shows, the subsequent big capture on the February 24th invasion, and then the sort of gradual Ukrainian recapture of territory. So if you wanted an overall summary of how control of terrain has developed as a percentage of total Ukrainian terrain, I thought it was a helpful graphic. The next block I wanted to get into was to talk about a couple of events, including Exit alluded to the Russian drone strikes on the Danube ports, but they're quite close to Romania. And then so there were some allegations by locals in Romania that some of the Russian drones, whether by error or as a result of being shot down by air defense, may have landed on Romanian territory. And then there was an incident a few days ago where Belarusian helicopters definitely overflew Polish territory. I think they went about 2 kilometers deep over Polish territory. And to kind of, but to bring that together as more of a summary, that second item back in the nest, it's quite a long tweet by the account Raver. And they've included a bunch of their own analysis. I don't know that I can endorse everything that's said in that analysis, but it starts off with a description of several recent events that would seem to be intentional moves by Russia to provoke NATO. And I just wanted to highlight, to bring them together, there was the downing of a U.S. drone over the Black Sea. And I'll add to that there was recently damage to a U.S. drone over Syria by Russia. There's the threatened naval blockade of the Ukrainian coast. There were threats that Wagner in Belarus may be used against Poland. Lukashenko came out and said, maybe they'll take a day trip. We had the Belarusian helicopters flying over Poland. We had the Shahed attacks along the Romanian border. There were allegations that Wagner and or Belarusian troops may have been assisting migrants to cross into Poland. There's the deployment of Russian nuclear weapons onto Belarusian territory. Putin came out and talked about how Western Poland was a gift to that country by Stalin. All kinds of various threats. So it does seem like there's been a lot of provocative comments made, and that they seem to be escalating toward actions, which is alarming. So I just wanted to put those all together because you probably have seen them separately, but seeing them all together gives it a bit of a different feel. I'll pause. Do you want to go ahead, Woke?
Yeah, I just had a question. Do you think the fact that the helicopter wasn't shot down or whatever, it seems like it, I don't know if that's considered deep into the territory of Poland, if a helicopter was,
yeah.
How long would that trip be? How long were they over the land? Those are the things that come to mind.
Sure. So I have several materials on that. I'll get to that in just a moment. I had just put up the materials on the drone strikes alleged to have landed on Romanian territory first, then we'll get to Poland. So if you were to look at the fourth item back, this is the tweet from the Kiev Independent. They note that the Romanian government has now said that they are investigating reports of debris falling on their territory. I had the original claims, but the reason I didn't include them is because, according to the Kiev Independent reporting, the Romanian Air Force has now come out and said that they've inspected the site where there was claimed to have been the downing of a drone. They said they didn't find any concrete the phrase in quotation marks is they didn't find any concrete elements to prove these allegations. Interestingly, the mayor of a village there had actually spoken with a Romanian news outlet, saying both that some locals claim to have seen drones overflying their property, and then others citing the downing in a forested area. But so far, the Romanian government is saying that they've looked for evidence and they haven't been able to find it. The fifth item back in the nest is with regard to, if you were to look in my agenda, it's a direct link, like a web link, not a tweet. I do have a link to the actual statement made by the Romanian Ministry of Defense. I'll pause. Exit, go ahead.
Whatever Romania has said, we know that there have been NATO ISR assets up in the air watching the Danube River ports pretty much daily since Russia pulled out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. They've been watching a whole bunch of different things that we are very clear that they are watching. It seems like they probably knew exactly where those drones went and which airspace they went into, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to react to that by any means, but it's probable that they actually do have some evidence that maybe they aren't willing, like they aren't just talking about. But just because they're not talking about it doesn't mean that they're not actually aware of what's going on there. On the drones versus missiles thing, somebody else pointed out to me in the comments that specifically for those ports, you might use the Shaheds instead of the missiles, because if you did happen to go off target and end up in Romania somehow, that's a much smaller munition to actually land in Romania, and probably less of a discussion about it than if you had a very large missile that actually landed there.
Yeah, that's a fair point about the munition size. With regard to whether they have radar tracks, what they would speak to or admit, we'll put it. It's interesting because if we move on to the Belarusian helicopters that had reportedly overflew Polish territory, there was a weird back and forth where local news was reporting accounts of locals saying, hey, there are helicopters flying over our village. And the Polish government came out and initially said, the helicopters were sighted from this village, but it's 2 kilometers away from the border. There's no evidence that they actually crossed over Polish territory. And so that was the initial response. And then Poland came out and sort of changed their account and said, yes, they did overfly Polish territory, but this was only after video footage from the ground came out that made it indisputable that it had happened in that way. And in some ways that mirrors a bit of the confusion over the missiles that landed on Polish territory that are now believed to have been Ukrainian air defense missiles, where Poland didn't, notice them immediately, and then there was a fair bit of confusion about their origin. So, when you say that there were NATO ISR assets up that should have seen the Shahed tracks, given that past experience of the air defense missiles not being, definitively stated up front, I do think there's a fair bit of scope for uncertainty. And I'll get to my points on it in a minute, but go ahead, Nukes.
So I watched that one pretty closely when it happened, the incursion in the Poland. If you look at the border right there, there's a bend in the border, and there's also a small little, I don't know what you want to call it, zigzag in the border. It's quite possible they were flying right along the border and were only in Polish airspace for seconds. It doesn't look like it was a big incursion. The village is 2 to 3 kilometers from the border. And even in the Polish, I'm not sure if it's Ministry of Defense or whatever they call it, Defense Department, they came out and said that they were underneath the radar net and they were not seen on radar. So, radar requires line of sight. In most cases, it has to be able to, the antenna of the radar has to be able to see the aircraft or the target in question. And when you have terrain and really tall trees and things like that in the way, like you do in that area, it is entirely possible that they're underneath the radar, and they probably know where the radar coverage is and fly under it on purpose, so for training purposes. So it's not, I don't think this is, I think it's being blown up a little bit compared to, what actually happened versus, the seriousness of the event.
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't heard the definitive claim that it was not on radar, but that's interesting to know. Patrick, would you like to go ahead?
Hey, Michael, thank you for having me up. I'll echo the last speaker. I'm sorry, I couldn't see the name. I'm driving. This is an area of rapidly changing borders and some terrain, and the helicopters were flying low, though not nap of the earth. I think this is probably a gray zone incursion. We'll never know if it was a mistake from a training exercise or if it was an actual test of Polish air defense radar capability. But the point you raise about the conflicting narratives is an interesting one. And I would say that it speaks to the level of caution that President Duda and his administration have shown when it comes to this war. Recall, they were very hesitant to condemn anyone specifically when that what was probably an S-300 landed in Poland months ago. They waited a long time. They wanted to know exactly what happened before they spoke. And despite some very bellicose rhetoric out of their military and other portions of their government, the presidency and the Minister of Defense specifically waited until they knew what it was before they, made an official statement about it. I think they're being very, very cautious, correctly so, and I think this is, this is just more of the same. And on the Romanian thing, it's important to note the Romanian Minister of Foreign Affairs has confirmed that during those port strikes in the Danube, a Romanian flagged vessel was hit and was caused some minor damage, no casualties. But this, in conjunction with the drone incidents you mentioned, this is Russia telling the rest of the world, in my opinion, that it's only going to tolerate so much from the West, and where it can legitimately cause us concern or even strike Western flagged vessels if they're operating in a designated war zone, they will do so. And my hunch on that is that they're trying to forestall further Western involvement, but that's just a personal opinion.
I'm totally open to that analysis particularly of the drone strikes near Romania. With regard to the helicopters over Poland, in a moment, I'll get to the source of this, but the Belarusian Hagen project did a very interesting breakdown explaining that those particular helicopters are assigned to do sort of like a security sweep around the territory where Lukashenko is. And apparently Lukashenko is staying at a cottage that's only about 10 kilometers from the border. And so apparently those helicopters are like a personal security cordon, and not like a training flight, as some has suggested. So there is a little bit of insight on that, if the Belarusian Hagen project is to be believed. But we'll go to Trent and then to Nukes. Go ahead, Trent.
I'm just going to remind everyone that a Russian cruise missile that had not a warhead, but something else, it was one of their strategic missiles that was intentionally fired at Ukraine, wound up landing deep inside of Poland, and nobody noticed the thing until some guy in the forest found it. So the idea that NATO has a good radar net across the Polish border has been disproven a number of times. The AWACS aircraft, the NATO E2s, use a very old rotating radar array that rotates 10 times a minute. So that means they're only going to be looking at any one part of the border for the few seconds out of that 6 seconds it's pointed in the right way. If you've got a good electronic warfare listening system and a data link to a drone, you can quite literally tell the drone to fly parallel to the AWACS track whenever it's actually looking. And since we're dealing with a pulse Doppler radar, which measures the relative velocity between the AWACS and the target, you can basically do a Z pattern and kinematically defeat the radar. This has been in some papers. And a lot of people are in denial about this particular reality, but the issue for NATO is it needs to get some phased array airborne early warning radars to watch its borders. The current generation of AWACS are technologically obsolescent, and something like the E7 that Turkey has and that Australia has needs to be fielded ASAP for dealing with modern low-level threats and hypersonic threats, neither of which are amenable to real tracking by a radar that rotates once every 6 seconds. Over to you.
Okay, thanks for that. Nukes, go ahead, and then we'll go to skate park.
Yeah, I put the statement up in the nest up there from the B&O News Live. It basically says it was in an area that was hard to track by radar. And I agree 100%. Those, I would almost guarantee that there is notching going on, which is flying parallel to the radar. If you note, after this incursion, instead of them sending an E3 up, they sent up an E8 J-Stars. So that tells you something, that they're having some trouble with that, because the J-Stars has a better ground-based moving target indicator, which doesn't work very well for high-flying aircraft, but for things like helicopters, it could be pretty effective, I would assume. I'm, of course, not privy to that information, but it was interesting that instead of E3 being launched immediately, it was an E8 that came up.
Interesting. I hadn't seen that. Skate Park, go ahead.
Yeah. Some background on this so-called Polish missile crisis, which happened with strategic cruise missile from training missile across the border into Poland. It was actually noticed. So the Polish Defense Forces sent up some planes, F-16s and F-35s were sent to the area, but the defense minister didn't really want to make a fuss about it, so he only sent a police patrol to look in the forest. They didn't do a proper search and stuff like that, so it created a sort of a confidence crisis between the Polish defense force and the defense minister and the president. So it was a bit of a scandal in Poland when this happened. We might not want to jump to the conclusion that they didn't see it on the radar, but that they maybe didn't handle it correctly. And also in this event, I think it's probably true that Poland didn't see this incursion because it was a very shallow incursion and low level. So in this case, I think actually it's correct that it didn't see it. So, but that missile was apparently seen on radar.
Interesting. That's going back a ways, so I just don't recall that. We've spoken to some of these points, but just because I like to get the sources in as well. If you were to have a look in the nest, we're dealing with the sixth, 7th, 8th items back. So the 6th back is a tweet from D. Mojavensis, who does good OSINT work. He did a geolocation of the footage of the helicopters flying over Polish territory, and you can see both the video and his identification of the site. The 7th item back in the nest is the statement from the Polish Ministry of Defense. And interestingly, the Polish Defense Ministry says that Belarus was carrying out training near the border and that the Belarusian side had informed Poland about this training. But then when you look at the 8th item back, it's the tweet from the Belarusian Hagen project that I referred to a moment ago, where in this thread, they're explaining that Lukashenko is at a cottage quite near the border, apparently about 10 kilometers away. And apparently this was a sweep by helicopters that are sort of stationed to accompany him when he travels. I don't think it was in this same tweet I have in the nest, but if you do go to the account of the Belarusian Hagen project, they subsequently also tweeted out noting that when those pilots landed, apparently they were met by Belarusian security forces. And so the Hagen project doesn't come out and say it, but they seem to be implying that the incursion into Polish territory was unexpected by the Belarusians as well, and that perhaps the reason they had the state security services meet them was to, interview them, debrief them, and say, like, what were you guys trying to do? Was that an error? And whether that's both to evaluate their own fitness as pilots, but then I presume also to ensure that they have a good story if they have to, if it becomes a major issue, so that they thoroughly understand what happens. That implies that it wasn't pre-planned. But we'll go to skate park and then nukes.
Yes, so another detail in that was those 2 helicopters were sent back to the airport air base near Minsk and replaced by 2 new helicopters at the base at the border. So that seems to to confirm that that interpretation.
I did hear that as well. And by the way, it's for anything coming out of Belarus, that account, Belarusian Hatred Project, is definitely the one to follow. Nukes, go ahead.
Just one thing to note, and this is just speculation based on informed speculation, I guess, but we have seen over and over and over again these older helicopters flying in Russian service using, like Garmin or other consumer-level GPS receivers, GNSS receivers. You may even see like a tablet or a phone in there for navigation. And as we all know, they have just been blanketing at least the areas of active fighting with jamming. Now, if Lukashenko was near the border, my guess is they were probably blanketing that area with jamming as well. So it wouldn't be surprising if there was a navigation problem, and that would honestly account for maybe changing them out for newer helicopters. So that is just something little tidbit to maybe look into there.
Yeah, that's a great point. We have seen that several times in terms of the commercial navigation equipment. So that's a interesting consideration that maybe it was an equipment fault. Okay, so moving on to the next topic I wanted to talk about were the drone strikes on Moscow, which have been ongoing for several days now, and in many ways escalating. So if you were to have a look at the first item in the nest, it's a tweet from Christian Tribert, who runs the Visual Investigations Group at the New York Times. And this is just a background on the first set of strikes that Ukraine carried. Well, so I think we can pretty clearly say that it was Ukraine that carried out these strikes. My understanding is that the Ukrainian government has made statements about it's entirely fitting that the war should come home to Russia, and phrasing it in that way without saying we are carrying out the strikes. As far as I know, that's been their phrasing. So this first tweet is just background on that initial strike, with some details, because it's occurred now over several nights. I'm not sure of the number of drones involved in total. I believe on the first night it was reported to be 3, with 1 downed and 2 striking buildings. I'm not sure how many were deployed on the second night, although I do know that there were multiple strikes on that evening as well. But if we continue in the material, the third item back, also from Christian Tribert, he has included a video of one of the drones in flight, fairly up close, and he suggests that it's likely to be one of the newly designed Ukrainian Bober drones, which I believe is Ukrainian for beaver. And it has a fairly distinct wing pattern where the propeller is actually in the rear of the drone, and it has smaller wings up front. I'm not sure if the proper term for it would be canard, but I'm sure somebody will correct me on that. But they have smaller wings up front and then a larger set of wings in the rear of the body. And the fourth item back is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, a video on the development of the Bober drone, which has been an ongoing project from the Pritula Foundation, which is run by Serhiy Pritula, who has been, crowdfunding or privately funding the development of long-range drones. So you can see in the background of that video, and essentially that video is trolling. They're basically saying what could possibly have the range to reach Moscow while they walk in front of the drones that they've developed. So that gives you a sense of what they are. Later on in our material tonight in the agenda, when we get to Ukrainian equipment, there are a variety of other drones that Ukraine has developed quite recently, which will be interesting. But it does seem like these strikes over the last few days have been carried out by the Bober. One thing that was noted is that across the various nights of strikes, if you have a look at the fifth item back in the nest from Christo Grozev, who is one of the founders of Bellingcat, one building was struck on multiple nights. and it's called the the IQ quarter, I believe is the name, and it's a set of 2 towers, and it's building number 2 that's been hit 2 nights in a row. And as you can see in Christo's tweet, it's noted that that building contains several of the government ministry offices, apparently 7 different ministries. And I know because somebody had suggested it to me that there are also, for example, the offices of the Russian Agricultural Bank, which is the bank that Russia keeps arguing should be excluded from sanctions or reconnected to SWIFT as part of their demands to consider rejoining the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And so because of the wealth of targets in that building, people were looking at it and saying, oh, were they targeting the bank? Were they targeting this ministry or that ministry? I believe the first night, the 10th floor was hit, and the second night, it was either the 20th or 21st floor. And I think when the 10th floor was hit, they said it was something like the Ministry of Digital Media. So it's not clear whether the items being hit are very specifically targeted, or whether it's because it's a large target that is a target-rich environment. It's just not clear to me, but you guys may have more insight into that. The 6th item back is a note that because of these ongoing attacks on Moscow, a lot of businesses that operate downtown, including several ministries, like this is an article from Medusa, noting that the Russian Economic Development Ministry will have its employees work remotely until the 1st of September because of the ongoing threat of drone strikes. So, there is some impact there. I note that there were some interviews that were held with citizens of Moscow, some of whom seemed completely unconcerned, others who said, what's the administration doing? But it's interesting that reactions were so mixed. I know that there was also a fair bit of publicity around some interviews that were conducted of citizens in Taganrog, which there's a Russian airbase there, and some drones also struck the city there in the last few days. And the interview with citizens of Taganrog suggested that the majority of them weren't concerned with the ongoing drone strikes. And so it's, to the extent that it's meant to have symbolic value and create political pressure, it's not entirely clear to me that the Russian populace is engaged enough to be outraged. I believe we covered it previously, so I didn't include it in these materials. But about a week ago, there was also a drone strike on Moscow that appeared to hit GRU offices, so Russian intelligence. And the point was made by an OSINT account called Evergreen Intel, she has developed a map of the air defense systems around Moscow and how dense they are, and just noting how absurd it is that, across multiple nights, multiple drones have been able to actually strike downtown Moscow. As a final point on this block, just before we go to hands, it's the 7th item back in the nest. I'm sure this will be controversial, but it was a statement from the deputy spokesman for the United Nations Secretary General, who came out to condemn drone attacks on civilian facilities. Now, I don't know, it would take a little bit to confirm whether, for example, that IQ quarter building would be a civilian facility, given that it's it holds so many government offices. But plenty of people have suggested where has been the outrage from these same people about Russian attacks, and proportional scale of outrage at Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilian targets. But they came out pretty quickly to condemn attacks on Moscow. Trent, go ahead.
All right. the point about the density of Russian air defenses versus the ability of Ukrainian drones to penetrate. First, we have to realize that Ukraine has access to C-band and X-band satellite radar. Bellingcat came out before the war with his radar interference tracker using C-band and X-band. Those two bands cover pretty much the entire fielded fleet of Soviet and Russian surface-to-air missiles. So basically, if the Ukrainians get 2 orbits of these commercial satellites that cover the Moscow area, they can pinpoint on a map exactly where every one of those active radars are. And if you're a SAM, you've got to have your radar up in order to be operational. So with that, they can take a digital map and quite literally plan a route that is below the line of sight of almost every radar that they are aware of through the interference tracking tool. This is one of the threads that I did early on. The current generation of surface-to-air missiles is obsolescent because of that sort of satellite tool. The combination, everyone has access to Google Maps. They know exactly what the terrain is with competent mission planning software that pretty much every Air Force in the world has now. You can plan a mission route that will minimize radar coverage. And when you do pop out, you're going, and if the radar you're dealing with is pulse Doppler, you can use notch tactics to cover small routes between covered, undetectable, below line of sight routes to penetrate air defense systems. The United States SMAC Standoff Missile Activity Center that is in Louisiana has been using this particular tool since 2015. That is doing computer mapping of missile routes that avoid the majority of radar tracking, such that the defending SAMs don't get a long enough track to generate a intercept shot to penetrate defenses. I heard the commander in 17 detail how they worked out their stuff through an Association of Old Crows meeting in Dallas. So the fact that Ukrainian drones can penetrate very deeply and all the way into Moscow simply represents the arrival of satellite tools and digital planning that makes current SAM systems obsolescent. And it's simply a matter of you're going to have, the designers of surface-to-air missiles are going to have to either shift frequencies or get some really, really sophisticated spread spectrum radar technology to avoid satellite interference tracking. Over to you.
Well, that's a good point about the idea that just because they can detect that there's something incoming doesn't necessarily mean that they can track it with sufficient accuracy to target it. But I'll go over to nukes.
Yeah, well, I didn't know we were going to go into that, but it's interesting because that is something I'm very familiar with and work with all the time, is locating systems based on C-band interference, because I don't have access to the X-band ISI or Umbra as Ukraine does, but it is very interesting that others are using the tool. Not only can you get locations, you can get type as well quite easily when you FFT the data back into its frequency over time view. I mean, it's like having a spaceborne ELINT receiver in the open source. It's pretty amazing. But I will add that so for Sentinel-1, it is C-band, 5.405 gigahertz plus or minus 100 megahertz. So there's 200 megahertz of spectrum there, which the MPQ-65 Patriot radar falls closely in that band, yet we have not seen it over Ukraine. So somebody knows how to keep this under wraps, whether they're just turning that radar off during the satellite passes or if something more sophisticated is going on, don't know. Secondly, one of the missiles that hit Tagnarog, I always get that word messed up, but it was clearly an S-200 in a ballistic trajectory. And the fact that that wasn't shot down speaks a lot, because, you know, that thing would have went 150,000, 200,000 feet in the air to go that far. And they should have had a clear radar view of that for quite a bit of its flight path. And I was really surprised that that didn't get intercepted. So we have noted, and I do a lot of tracking of everything, and I would highly recommend Breaking Craft. He's on Twitter. He maintains the RMI, the Russian Military Index 1.51. He's added a whole bunch of stuff to the base file. It's a KML file. Anybody can download it. It's on GitHub. But he has an almost complete picture of air defense assets in Russia. And I'm not talking about just Western Russia. The entire country is mapped quite well. Yes, some things have moved since the imagery he's used, but they haven't moved a lot of the big fixed S-400, S-300 sites around and the large radar sites. So if you want to have a look at that, it's pretty interesting. And then some of the work that Evergreen Intel did the other day, where they took all of the imagery, geolocated it, and found a lot of the more mobile sites, like the Panzers. They're sitting on the roofs of these buildings and things. You know, and I've taken a lot of that data and made line of sight coverage plots for it. And certainly exactly what you were saying. I mean, I'm assuming Ukraine also has friends in high places that have access to this information, and they're flying a path of least resistance, I guess you might want to call it. They're flying in between the sites, and we don't know if those drones have any kind of radar warning receiver on them or threat detection receiver that may autonomously do something, because you can hear a radar before it can see you. You know, you can detect its signal before it can see you every time, because it's power of 2 going one way, and then you come back the other way, and it makes it the power of 4. So if you do have some kind of autonomous stay out of the area receiver on those, they could be doing that too. That's another speculation that's been out there. And the same thing with the Shaheeds. There has been some Shaheeds. There's been some speculation that may be going on with those, but we haven't been able to confirm it. So that's my little 2 cents worth. Back to you.
I hope that you're keeping a list of mysteries or open questions, because it would be great ultimately to see how many of them we wind up getting answers to and how many stay secret. Particularly that observation of the Patriot radar not showing up, whether it's procedural or whether there's something else going on. Okay, so I wanted to move into updates on the Ukrainian equipment. So we will run through that hopefully pretty quickly. I tend to divide it up into ground equipment, high-end like jets, and then drones. So this first set is just more about overall. As you'll see from the first item in the nest, the tweet from Paul McCleary, that there are now reports that the Pentagon is working to award $40 billion worth of contracts to supply Ukraine. And I heard, and I see that Colby's hand went up right away, which is great because I get most of this from his coverage, that there is some huge amount of outstanding equipment under the USAI program that has been announced but hasn't actually been contracted for. And I did see it. I noted that apparently of this 40 billion, something like half is intended to just resupply U.S. stocks of equipment that's already been provided to Ukraine. But for more detail, we'll go to Colby.
Thank you. So Politico is saying, and this is behind the paywall, but they're saying that there's 16.4 billion under USAI that still has not been contracted, and there is 20.5 billion in PDA replacement that has not been contracted yet. This is a misinterpretation of the Pentagon's numbers. They basically just misread it. They don't understand what the information that they're reading is actually saying. So for PDA, it's actually half of that. It's not 20 billion. It's around 10 billion. For USAI, I have to double check, but it's probably, again, roughly half of what they're saying, which is still a huge amount of money. This is something that I've been talking about for a very long time, that the pace of contracting is extremely slow. And for the drawdown authority replenishment, that doesn't matter as much. These are systems that do need to be replaced in U.S. stock. But in some cases, the U.S. is buying brand new systems. Well, in all cases, they're buying brand new systems, but they may be buying systems that are just coming online. So they may have to wait in any case for those systems to reach full production to really start replacing old stuff with. So that's fine. I'm not really concerned about that. But with USAI, there's billions of dollars worth of systems that have been promised to Ukraine and announced, and you can read about them in the press releases. And the contracts to actually make those systems still haven't been issued after many months. And you can pick any major system that's been promised to Ukraine, whether it's NASAMS or something else. It's weeks or months to get any of these contracts signed to start making the system. And there's still a very significant backlog, which is very, very problematic. So the problem is not as big as it as you were led to believe based on this report, because their numbers are incorrect, but it's still very significant. And I really don't have a whole lot of time because I'm still working on attacking stuff, but I will try and write a thread next week about this to answer all these questions.
So I was following it in extremely close detail for about the first year. I'm not quite as in touch with it now. It would be interesting to see, just on the equipment front, what the ratio is of promised and delivered value to promised and yet undelivered values, because it seems like there's quite a lot of things that have been committed but not yet provided from the United States. But we'll go to Trent. Go ahead.
On what you're speaking about directly, when Ukraine kicked off its offensive, only 15% of the promised mine clearing equipment had been delivered by Western sources. So it's really hard to do an armored thrust when you don't have the mine clearing equipment put on the front of your tanks like the Western powers had promised Ukraine. So essentially, Ukraine has had to use good old-fashioned infantry and engineers with sticks. And this is one of the things that I have found to be exceedingly dirty, to use a word, by the Western powers and the Biden administration specifically, in terms of they're saying what they give to Ukraine and what's actually been delivered. There are lives that are dependent on this stuff being delivered, particularly the mine clearing equipment, in a timely manner. And there's simply no excuse. Over to you.
Thanks, Trent. We'll go back to Colby and then to Tara. Go ahead, Colby.
Thanks. And I think your mic might be breaking up again, so I'll let you deal with that while I speak. So there's $7 billion worth of equipment that has been, that there's contracts issued for under USAI. But of that, still only a fraction is actually delivered, because some of these systems have very long lead times, right? When we talk about NASAMS, Ukraine has 2 to 3 NASAMS, probably 3 by now, 3 NASAMS batteries from the United States that have arrived in theater by now. Those take a long time to make. So even though the contracts have been signed for those systems, Ukraine's still not going to see them for a while, because there's long lead time to build these very complicated systems. Like the radars in particular are definitely, probably one of the more complicated aspects to get those made. So, any delay in signing the contracts is just hugely problematic because it's already going to be a long wait for some of these really important systems. So for the Department of the Defense to waste weeks or months on sole source contracts too, because it's not like there needs to be any sort of competitive bidding process here. NASAMS is made by Raytheon and Kongsberg. There's no other contractor. It goes to them. So the United States knows when they decide, okay, we're going to give Ukraine NASAMS, they know that contract is going to be signed with Raytheon. And there's many cases like this where there's one prime contractor for specific weapon systems that are being pledged. If there's just a general, tender being issued, we need to provide Ukraine with small arms, right? That's something where lots of different companies could fill that need. But for, high-end specific systems that are being promised, where there's one company that it's their intellectual property, they developed it, they make it. What is the reason that it takes the months to get these contracts hammered out? It's just, all I can say is, and Trent probably can speak about this, just the Department of Defense has become so big and so bureaucratic, and they just move at a snail's pace, and there seems to be no sense of urgency in correcting this problem. And the Ukrainians are unfortunately paying in blood for the slowness of the administration in fixing this problem.
So because Colby mentioned you, Trent, we'll go to you, and then we'll go to Tara. Go ahead, Trent.
Look, the contracts people that I dealt with in Defense Contract Management Agency could cut a mod to an existing contract to add additional equipment in a few days. They had to get the money from DoD level, get the whole comptroller rigmarole done, and then hand it to the service that gave out the money and the authority to DCMA to do the contract. That's where the holdup is. The actual administrative cutting of a modification can be done in a day, depending on the particular contract. I mean, if you're simply adding additional numbers of something with additional money, that is a relatively simple administrative operation to execute. That it is taking weeks and months implies some sort of fight or go slow at the Department of Defense level to the service that is in charge of the program. So if you're talking bureaucracy, the administration of the contract is relatively quick. It is the decision that is, okay, we've made the commitment, somebody at DoD level, you're talking Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition. His office and DoD comptroller has got to turn loose the money to the program office for DCMA to cut a mod. So if you're looking at a go slow, it's going to be at that level. The administrative action is fundamentally trivial and is relatively easily done every day. That there is a go slow implies politics at senior levels. There's simply no other option in this particular case. Over to you.
Tara, please go ahead.
Okay, no. I mean, I on that point, I agree with you guys. I do a lot of those contracts myself, and it all depends on. I mean, the actual work, the budget, and all that, the paperwork can be done in a day, but getting the sign-offs and all of that, it's a ton of bureaucracy, and it just depends on what's going on at that time, like you said. I had a broader question, and I don't know if you guys all get into this, and my kids are from Ukraine, so I followed this very closely, and I'm very interested in this aspect of it, but I'm also now very interested in the broader aspect of it all, because we had the NATO meeting a couple of weeks ago and said we're increasing our troops to 300,000, along the eastern flank. And then now in 3 weeks from now, we have the BRICS meeting, and I feel like they're going to have their response to us, and they're going to have their currency announced, which is going to definitively challenge the US dollar. And this is what most wars are fought about, is power, and money equals power. So I don't know if this is what you guys get into at all, but into your, when you're looking at your open source intelligence, does it tell you anything else? Does it tell you that things are going to go broader than Ukraine and Russia or whatever? And if you want to just stick to Ukraine and Russia, I'm totally interested in that too, because again, that's where my kids are from. That's where, like, I follow every day. I talk to people every day, and I try to tell them, because we have more intelligence than they do. And I want to keep them safe, and we've already had a bunch of family members die, so that's of utter importance to me too. But I also wonder about the broader implications of maybe what might happen if your intelligence is telling you anything else, if that makes sense. But
sure. So on your question with regard to BRICS, I don't know that anything on the battlefield will be affected around the BRICS summit. If you joined more recently, the items I speak to, I have an agenda. We usually don't get through all the material. If you were to go all the way to the first item on the right in the nest and click on it, it opens the thread, and the speaking notes are below. And if you were to scroll all the way to the bottom of it, like, I think it continues in a part 2, because you can only post so many at once in a tweet, in a thread. I have a section on diplomacy that includes a brief discussion of developments around the upcoming BRICS meeting. And I won't go into it at length now, but there was some skepticism where Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, might not attend. And there was some analysis that suggested that Modi may be a little bit more reluctant about, increasing economic ties with India and China, or excuse me, with Russia and China. There is also talk about BRICS potentially adding more members at this upcoming summit. So, like, there are a lot of moving parts. When you talk about them releasing their currency, I'm not aware of them releasing a joint currency. No talk about it. And so I don't think that's a particularly significant threat. We may not get to that part of the conversation in our available time, but I would suggest maybe you have a look at that. Because I like following the economic angles of this, because I did undergrad and I'm a finance lawyer. So you can always just have a look at my profile from time to time. I tweeted a bunch of things out about the ruble and its relationship with its BRICS allies just yesterday. So hopefully that gets to a bit of it.
No problem. I appreciate that. And I guess I was more referring to maybe even what's happening in Africa and some of Russia's troops moving down there. And any of that, like, that's,
Sure.
I appreciate it.
Again, in the materials, if you were to scroll all the way to the end of the materials, the very last section is on developments in Niger. And there's a whole bunch, and there's also a section in the agenda on Wagner that we may get to in just a minute, and its evolving role in Africa. So we do touch on a bunch of those things. We just often don't have time to get to all of them.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Push me down if you need to.
Sure. And just for people who are new to Spaces, the 3 buttons at the top of the window, you can always click that and go to switch to listener. If you want to shift down from speaker. So we'll go back to the topic at hand. I believe it was Skate Park and then P-verse. So go ahead, Skate Park.
Yeah, thanks. I hope it's not the contracting itself that's holding things up. I'm just hoping that they are actually contracting at the pace that the manufacturers are able to scale up the production. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. Like here in Norway, one of the contracts for producing more artillery had to wait for formal approval before the factory could start moving on it, because it just not any risk capital available for those sort of contract projects. Now on mine clearing equipment, I think actually Ukraine has enough of it for what they're doing at the moment, because they got lots of mine clearing charges, they got mine plows, they got other engineering equipment. They might be missing a bit of smoke artillery, because when you're doing an armored breakthrough, you want to do this at night. Germany has started giving them more smoke, but I think the problem seems to be two things. It's obviously, you mentioned the lack of air power. Ukraine can try to compensate a bit by using like HIMARS as a tactical weapon, but not fully. And lack of air defense at the front. They have to prioritize air defense for protecting their cities or protecting their armored maneuver. So that's a dilemma for the Ukrainians. But it also seems that one of the problems is coordination on the level of brigade and up, because some of the feedback from the front to military experts seems to be that Ukrainians are able to work pretty well as platoons and battalions, but once they try to coordinate between artillery units and maneuver from brigade and up, they are struggling with stuff like if a battalion is not ready at the starting line at the planned time, then the artillery starts firing too early for them. So when the artillery is done firing and suppressing, the Russians have time to go back to their positions and meet the maneuver. So it seems to be that sort of thing that is the problem actually, and not just the lack of equipment.
Yeah, thanks for that. We've heard similar reports and discussed it briefly before, but that's a great reminder. So we'll go to Peavers and then to Aaron. Go ahead, Peavers.
Hey, thanks, Michael. So for you and for Colby, do you guys trust the Kiel Institute numbers?
No, the Kiel is not well regarded.
It isn't. Okay. So for their updated monthly numbers, they suggest that about 85 billion has been delivered in country. How far off is that number, do you think?
I think it's within the realm of the possibility. The problem is that a lot of European countries do not have a public tally of the things that they're sending. The United States is pretty transparent in what's going over there. Germany is as well as pretty transparent. But beyond that, not many other countries are publishing the detailed kinds of lists that they are. And that's one of the nice things about Germany. And we all have very many gripes about the way that they're approaching this war, but at least the lists are fairly transparent. But it's very hard to make determinations about what's going over when a lot of it is classified. So it's hard to get an accurate assessment, but yeah, the United States has pledged over 40 billion. Not that much is delivered. So 80 might be a little bit high actually, but again, it's very difficult to say, just because again, very few countries are publishing the sort of list you would need to even get a ballpark figure. And then there's the matter of how you're actually counting and evaluating the equipment, which is obviously a controversy that we just went through with the Department of Defense. So
yeah, no, for sure. And that is a big issue. Like the amount of gear that exists in storage that hasn't been sent, it's the numbers are pretty large. So I appreciate your perspective on that very much. But so if you're saying then, if ADB is maybe the top of the figure, like after 18 months, it's incredulous, obviously, everybody who's in all of these spaces. And Stoltenberg has done a fine job, and he's a fine man. I spent more than a year in Norway. I love the culture. I love the people very much. But this is, NATO's built to prevent war. It hasn't done that. But now we're in war. And, to my mind, leading NATO right now as General Secretary and ambassador to NATO needs to be military men or women. The right people in the right positions of power make this stuff move, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting on that front that there was some debate over Stoltenberg continuing in his position for the next year, where there had been speculation that Wallace from the UK might succeed him. And I saw some analysts argue that the position of Secretary General is more of a diplomat to unite the members of the alliance, in that the Secretary General can't really compel members to do very much. So I take your point that a leader who is a person of action may have some benefits, but the authority of the role may not allow a military man to necessarily carry the alliance to the rescue.
Well, this is somebody like Ben Hodges or Jim Mattis in those two key positions, because a lot of NATO and in Brussels is about management. And it's so easy to get caught up in process, as a lot of people have just mentioned here, et cetera, and bureaucracy. But when you have people who understand how to manage people, and these two specific men have great histories in doing so, including in Europe, then that's what this war effort needs, 100%, in my opinion.
So we'll go to Colby, who I suspect is a response to that. Then we'll go to Aaron.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that Secretary General Stoltenberg has done a very good job. I have no objections with his term being extended. My concern is who's going to get that job next permanently. And that's something that the alliance, really the United States, has to think about this very carefully, because I don't think it's appropriate for the North Sea to have a monopoly on the Secretary Generalship, which they sort of do right now. And as for the point about being a diplomat versus sort of a military man, yes, this is 100% true. The Secretary General is a civilian position. It shouldn't be held by anybody from the military realm. The NATO has a supreme allied commander who is always an American general, and the Secretary General is always a European, and that's sort of the balance in the alliance, that the United States, is in charge of the military operations side, and the diplomatic civilian role is handled by a European. And I think that that's sensible, and it has worked and will continue to work so long as, again, that the Secretary Generalship is not monopolized by a small group of countries, which is currently the North Sea states, whereas the center of gravity in NATO has shifted to the Baltic Sea. This is, the Baltic and obviously the Black. But I mean, really, Sweden, Finland joining, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland. These are the countries that are really doing the heavy lifting in the alliance, and who occupies that chair should reflect that fact.
Thanks for that. Aaron, please go ahead.
Thank you, Michael. Just from the outside looking, I don't think America has any allies, and I don't think they have any friends. It's just my personal opinion. They have interests. And Nothing surpasses America's financial interests, and nothing ever surpasses America's home political interests. So Ukraine is an interest of America. The last time they did a shock and awe, that was in Iraq. And the ramifications afterwards was the void that was created, and was a very unpredictable situation that ended up being very messy. So what I see is that 500 Abrams, 500 Bradleys, 200 or 300 ATACMS and F-16s would be a level of shock and awe, which I think they probably estimate would break the Russian front line and then deliver a very unpredictable situation. I'm not saying I agree with all this, but this is sometimes I don't agree that Biden is silly. I don't agree that the MOD is silly and making bad decisions. I think they're making decisions that we don't like, but they're political decisions aimed at the next election, which is coming up in nearly a year and a half. So if you've got Russia falling apart in the next 12 months, that's going to affect the next election cycle. And I think the most important thing to Biden is that he gets re-elected. And I think the people around him would be saying, this is just my personal opinion, that Trump is a threat to democracy in America and could divide the country in a terrible way. He could attack NATO. He could divide. He could enable and other authoritarian leaders, as he did in Hungary and Turkey and a lot of areas. That all took off while he was in power. So I think it's a political decision, but a hometown political decision, which is a go slow, because the ramifications of doing everything that America could do are unpredictable, and they're making a decision that we don't like, but it is a decision that they think is right. I'll just leave that with you if you want to think about it. Thanks.
Okay, Aaron, I hear you. I mean, there are other interpretations. When you say it's a decision that they're making, to the extent that there may be some slow rolling going on, then that's definitely true, whether it's purely electoral or whether it's, there's been talk, for example, about some on the National Security Advisor group, and some people who at the Pentagon may have been opposed for particularly maybe ideological national security reasons. So there are probably several different motivations that could be contributing to political slow rolling. But given that, it does seem like the wheels are turning just slowly. I'm going to keep running through some of these updates on equipment because I know that interest and level of support can generate almost endless conversation. So that first item that inspired that long back and forth was about the $40 billion in contracting that's outstanding. The second item back is about how Biden's going to submit a supplemental budget in order to fund additional aid for both Ukraine and for Taiwan. And so, this is Colby's tweet, but it links to the Financial Times article on the matter. This is the first time that, as I understand it, that Taiwan is going to be funded in this way. And that's led to a bit of a debate. So if you have a look at the third item back in the nest, it's an article from The Economist where they talk about how Ukraine and Taiwan are now competing for American donations. And I've seen a couple of analysts, like there's one person who is a particular hawk on the Taiwan issue. His name is Elbridge Colby, and he's tweeted a fair bit about how certain systems to go to Taiwan, including Stingers and Javelins and the like, have been provided to Ukraine, and suggesting that there's direct competition. I don't know that that's true. I know that the Colby, who is a speaker with us, and others have highlighted the nature of weapons systems that would be used in Taiwan don't particularly overlap with the systems that are most needed in Ukraine at this time. And I would interpret the fact that the United States is now going to use a similar mechanism to provide military aid to Taiwan, as a deepening of commitment by the United States to Taiwan, not necessarily something that has to create a sense of competition. But we'll go to Colby for his thoughts.
Thank you. I will take issue with the arguments of my counterpart, we will say. So there was previously money that was appropriated for Taiwan. I'm trying to remember whether that was in the previous supplemental budget request. I think it probably was. I'm trying to find my tweet, but it doesn't matter. There was $1 billion that was appropriated for presidential drawdown authority for Taiwan. And that was some time ago. And the Biden administration was dragging this out for many months. And there was a fair bit of reporting on it about how it's been delayed and slow walked. And finally, just last week, they announced the presidential drawdown authority package for Taiwan, which was supposed to be $330 billion, and they did not provide the sort of lists that we're accustomed to receiving for Ukraine. It was classified what was being sent over, and they said that was for operational security reasons, that they weren't going to divulge the kinds of systems that were being provided. So that makes it, a little bit difficult to verify the full extent of whether there is true competition between Ukraine and Taiwan for systems. But for the most part, there is not. Prior to this drawdown package for Taiwan, every piece of military hardware that has been destined for Taiwan has been purchased by Taiwan through the Foreign Military Sales Program, which means that almost all these weapons are being bought from U.S. manufacturers, and that has lead time, right? And most of the things for Ukraine are coming through PDA, so they're coming through U.S. stocks. So to the extent that there is any overlap in weapon systems, yes, Taiwan does have orders for Stinger missiles, but those were orders coming from the manufacturer to be delivered at a future date. And the Stingers that Ukraine is getting are from U.S. stockpiles, so they're not actually coming out of the same pool. So a Stinger missile given to Ukraine has no impact on whether Taiwan will receive or when they will receive those Stinger missiles, because those Stinger missiles are being manufactured. And in fact, because the United States has been giving all these Stingers to Ukraine, which they would just have to be retired in the not too distant future anyway, because they're so old and would have to be demilitarized, which costs a lot of money. It's very good that these are being sent, because it has prompted the American companies to make investments in their production capacity. So now Stingers are actually being manufactured at a higher rate, and there's more of an effort to actually get the successor system to the Stinger put into production as well. So Taiwan, in many cases, is actually going to receive systems that they had on order faster because production rates are increasing. The HIMARS order that Taiwan has had for some time now, there was a recent update that's going to arrive at least 1 year ahead of schedule, because Lockheed has been making huge investments into their production capacity of both manufacturing HIMARS and of the GMLRS rocket systems as well. So the war in Ukraine is actually expediting arms deliveries to Taiwan. It's not compromising them at all, to the extent that there is competition for a select few number of systems. It's not actual competition, because they're coming out of different pools, PDA versus foreign military sales. So I would object to those that are suggesting that there is a competition here. And as Michael said, the systems that Taiwan really needs are completely different. Taiwan needs anti-ship missiles. They need to stop the invasion before it starts. Ukraine needs artillery, primarily. Artillery, tanks. These are things that Taiwan really doesn't need. If the Chinese are able to land very significant numbers of troops onto Taiwan, it's probably over already. So Taiwan does not need the same kinds of things. Sending artillery ammunition to Ukraine is not impacting American readiness or American arms deliveries to Taiwan, because they just fundamentally need very different kinds of systems. And Taiwan is, again, buying things new from the manufacturer. So there's not the same sort of competition for the key weapon systems that are really needed.
So hopefully there's a good understanding that develops, along those lines among policymakers, that support for Taiwan and support for Ukraine are not at odds for the reasons you laid out. Go ahead.
Sorry for going on here. One other thing I want to mention on this supplemental budget request, which the Financial Times is reporting is coming, the money that's been appropriated for presidential drawdown authority to go to Ukraine, that money is, I'm fairly sure, but not 100%, but pretty close, that money will expire at the end of this fiscal year. So at the very least, Congress has to reauthorize and reappropriate that money that may not be spent for the next fiscal year, which starts October 1st. So at the very least, that needs to happen. Even if they don't, if they don't appropriate new money, the money that's already there, President Biden will not be able to use that money if Congress does not reauthorize and reappropriate it for the next fiscal year. For USAI, that's already been done. It's good for fiscal year 2024, but that's not the case for drawdown authority. So there's a significant amount of money that still has not been utilized to send equipment. And so it's very, very important that Congress, at the very least, reappropriates that. And ideally, the president's going to submit this budget request, which I think it's very risky that he's waited this long to do this. And the administration said back in February that they planned to do it. And here we are in August, and Congress is going on recess now. So the amount of time that they have to do this is after Labor Day until the end of the month. They have to get the supplemental budget passed with this aid money, or at least reauthorize and reappropriate the remaining money from this year for the next year. If not, then there's no money left to send these drawdown packages to either Ukraine or Taiwan. And that's very problematic.
And just for the audience, I know this gets down into the weeds of legislative maneuvering, but I think it's important to understand how this works, because ultimately, if there's fear about a reduction in support for aid to Ukraine, slowdowns or fights will happen in these venues. And so coming to understand how it all works, I think is important. And it's, perhaps maybe a shame that some of these debates aren't examined in quite as much detail in some of the other countries, in France and so on, where the aid that's provided isn't quite as transparent as to how the decisions are made politically. But in the United States, because of the nature of the system, it can be followed in a little more detail. Okay, last points from this current block of material. It's going way back in the nest a bit, but it's the 8th and 9th items back. The 8th item back is a tweet by Rob Lee. He is just passing along a link to the Financial Times article from the other day that included a whole bunch of detail about efforts to ramp up ammo production in the United States. A lot of this covers material that we've discussed before. The point that Rob highlights that appears to be new is that an American official is reporting that Ukraine is currently firing 8,000 rounds of artillery per day, which is an insight that we didn't have before. But that, sort of in line with what we had heard, the U.S. is working to ramp up production of rounds to 90,000 rounds per month by 2025, compared with 24,000 rounds now. Related to that, the ninth item back in the nest, tweet by Christopher Miller, links to a Ukrainian article that discusses U.S. assistance in contracting for the supply of artillery ammunition from Bulgaria and from South Korea. So those are great developments as well. Just before I go to hands, the next little block of material I had set up, if you look at the first item in the nest, just on new ground vehicles, I'm not going to break them out in detail, but that first tweet notes 3 systems that, as far as I can tell, were brand new in the last couple of days in terms of being witnessed in use in Ukraine. They vary a fair bit. There's a Ukrainian multiple rocket launching system in there. There is sort of a smaller one-off system that was purchased by private buyers from Poland. And then there is the one that's more notable is the Rosomak, which is an armored personnel carrier, also from Poland, which it's apparently the first time it's been used. And I've seen reports saying that Poland is going to pass along up to 200 of those, which could be significant. But I'll pause. Go ahead, Skate Park.
Yeah, thanks. Just 2 quick questions on PDAs, on the presidential drawdown. Am I correct that that is delivering equipment which is already in the U.S. stocks, but that what needs to be reauthorized and reappropriated is the money to replenish those stocks? Because
yes, that's correct.
Yeah, thanks. And have they renewed the Lend-Lease mechanism? That hasn't actually been used yet, but it has to be renewed for a new fiscal year, if I understand correctly.
I'd have to double check. Honestly, I don't think it expired, but I will confirm that and get back to you. But it has not been utilized to date.
My understanding is that it will run out at the end of this fiscal year, but I have seen it announced. there are a bunch of systems that we're experimenting with names like Scythe and Achilles. This item has been posted by Sam Bendett, who focuses on military drone use specifically. I know from past discussion with him that he maintains a table. I think they included it in their report about 2 months ago, the Center for Naval Analysis report, where he was tracking every single system used by Ukraine and Russia. And I should reach out to him to ask if he has an updated copy of that table, because with all these new models in use, I think that would be really interesting. So I'll try and get a copy of that from him for you in the next session or two. The third item, back in the nest, it just refers to another new drone system that Ukraine has called the Rubak, that reportedly has a range of more than 500 kilometers. And so essentially, I'm just trying to flag you to all of these new systems that may be unlocking new potential. And in particular, this introduction of the Rubak says that Ukraine has already begun utilizing it in the field. The fourth item is a tweet from the Kyiv Independent discussing that there has been additional progress in the relationship between Ukraine and Baykar, which is the manufacturer of the Bayraktar drones. And while there has already been an agreement to create a drone factory, which may be on a longer time scale, apparently an agreement has now been reached to open up a drone service center. There was a bit of a discussion in Sam's space the other day about the role of Bayraktars. We don't hear about them much anymore, but he still speculated that they are in use, just being operated at a greater distance from Russian air defense, but they could still be useful to provide, sort of ISR type capabilities to target artillery and other drones as munitions. The fifth item, it's not something that's happening in Ukraine yet, but David Hambling tweeted this out, and he covers drone tech generally. And I thought it was interesting because I have little doubt that it's going to catch people's attention and probably start to be integrated. It's a company based in the US, I think in Texas, who has talked about manufacturing quadcopters that are essentially armored. And they talk about armoring that can shrug off a shotgun round. So there has been video of drones being shot at by, missile-based air defense systems. Certainly Ukraine has been using lots of air defense systems that are lighter than that. And so I have little doubt that as there's combat, drone on drone, we'll start to see increased armoring. Okay, the next block of updates is kind of a grab bag. So I'll put them up and just speak to them quickly. Then we'll move on to talk about Wagner and the Black Sea, and we'll see how much time we have after that. Just as a reminder, while we did include some material in the agenda tonight on developments in Niger, in the event that we don't get to them, we are reaching out to some friends of ours. For example, we recently had Cassius Belli join us, and he gave us a bit of a rundown on developments in Mali. But we're reaching out to him and to some of his friends to give us a bit of a background briefing on developments in Niger. We would have done it tonight as it's a hot topic, but most of them are based in Europe or Africa itself, and so it's probably early morning for them by now. They're probably just waking up. Okay, so here's sort of the grab bag on Ukrainian equipment issues. The first item up is a little mini documentary put together by France 24 on the Trembita that includes some additional details This is what they call the People's Cruise Missile. And included here are details about how it's actually going to have two different versions, one of which will carry a 20-kilogram warhead, and the other of which will be a decoy. And apparently the decoy is produced so inexpensively that they expect it to be used in very high numbers in order to overwhelm air defenses, whether to enable strikes by more advanced munitions after the fact, or simply to wear down the stock of Russian air defense munitions. So I don't believe that the Trembita has been deployed yet, but it'll be exciting to see when it hits the field. The second item, since we're on the missile topic, is just an update that German political figures have made comments indicating that it's remains unlikely. So not only has Germany said they're not going to provide the Taurus cruise missile, these recent official comments seem to suggest that they won't provide the Taurus unless the United States provides ATACMS, which sounds like it mirrors the tank debate a little bit, where Germany expected the United States to provide Abrams sort of as cover for them to approve provision of the Taurus, or provision of the Leopards, excuse me. And so despite the fact that the UK has provided Storm Shadow and France has provided variants on the Scalp, is apparently not enough for Germany to feel like they are part of a coalition. Third item back is just an update on additional provision of power walls on Starlinks. And this is a tweet from Mikhailo Fedorov, who is the Minister of Digital Transformation in Ukraine. And I included this here just because it has new numbers on that. Clearly, though, the Starlink has provided some essential capabilities to Ukraine that don't really or are not available from any other source. So I include those numbers coming from Ukraine because the fourth item, there was an article put out by the New York Times, which is linked to in this tweet from Shashank Joshi, about the incredible power that Starlink has. And I bring this up because it was in this article that there was a claim that at least once Elon Musk may have prevented the use of Starlink systems in operations that he personally disapproved of, which caused quite a controversy over the last few days. And then I believe it was also included in this article a report that the United States Defense Department would be buying several hundred Starlink systems that were going to come with a modification, meaning that they could not be remotely disabled by the company. And speculation was that those would be made available to Ukraine for use in applications where Starlink had previously said they could not be used. So there was talk about the company not permitting their use in drones, which, frankly is understandable from the company's perspective. But so the speculation was that since the DoD is buying them so they can't be disabled, they may be used specifically for those sorts of purposes that previously would have been prohibited. The fifth item, so I'll just speak to this last item and then we'll go to hands. But the fifth item back in the nest is a bit of a novelty. I don't know how significant this will become, but apparently this was the first transfer of seized firearms from the United States to Ukraine. So these were seized by the Miami Police Department, and they handed over about 100 small arms. In terms of cost, I don't know how, they're not particularly significant, but given the number of seized firearms in the United States, across the country, if this became a more widespread practice, it could probably have a significant number of firearms sent to Ukraine. However you may feel about that for domestic U.S. political purposes. I'm going to go to my co-host. I think it was Jacoby and then Exit.
Yeah, back to the items about Starlink. You had mentioned in there that it's understandable that the company might have its views on why, or understandable position of why they would limit use of their product. But I would question that because, if the company is providing this equipment to a country at war, had they expressly limited their use when they were provided? Or was their expectation, did they have an expectation that the equipment would not be used for a particular purpose, and that purpose has changed? Or I'm a little confused by why they would. I mean, if you're giving equipment into to people who are engaged in a war, highly likely that they're going to use that to defend themselves.
I don't know what representations were made by Starlink to Ukraine initially. It does sound like they've been used in applications that weren't anticipated. And so there have been several controversies over Starlink, including the reports that some of them ceased working near the front line. But that was partly because, I saw it argued that was likely because they were trying to geofence use of the Starlinks, not to limit where Ukraine could use them, but because by, the point in the war, several months after Starlinks had initially been provided, they were beginning to be captured by Russia. And they were trying to geofence them to prevent Russia from using captured Starlinks. But because of the way the satellite passes work, it just wasn't precise enough. And so Ukrainian positions right at the front line were being turned off because, they were too proximate to where it was thought the Russians may be using them. So that was one issue. The reason I say it could be understandable is that I think it was when some of the first USV, the drone boat attacks occurred, it appeared that there were Starlink receivers built into those drones. And I think that's when Starlink said, well, for various reasons, including the fact that our satellites overfly all of these countries, there are treaty rules about the militarization of space and so on. And so the concern was that there's a distinction between facilitating communication for military purposes and providing communication built into weapon systems. And I think that's where they were drawing the distinction. Whether you agree with it or not, I think it's at least understandable what their thinking was on it. I'm not saying that they should have been shut down unexpectedly or in connection with any specific operation, but that once they realized they were being used in that context, they wanted to make clear that wasn't within the intended terms of service. But it sounds like a bit of an understanding may have been reached if the U.S. Department of Defense is now purchasing ones that can't be shut down. Hopefully that covers some of the aspects you were asking about. Okay. Exit, go ahead, and then we'll go to Nukes.
I think Nukes was responding for that. So let's go to him first, and then I can come back in. Great.
Thanks. So as for Starlink, I will say that Iridium and Inmarsat and a few other providers do offer drone data link modems that are in use in militaries all over the world. So this isn't anything new when it comes to space treaties or anything like that. This has been going on for years. Even the backhaul video from U.S. military drones on a lot of cases has gone over commercial satellite providers where the DoD just buys transponder bandwidth. And I just wanted to speak a little bit to the can't be turned off. Starlink for a long time kind of did a deal where they had tiers of service, and they had a home service that was, fixed to your area. They had a commercial service that was fixed to an area. Then they had a mobile service, and then they kind of had like a high-tiered service that I've used before for emergency response and things like that, where it was thousands of dollars a month for a single terminal, but you're basically unlimited, and you're going to get the priority bandwidth, and you can set it up anywhere, in our case, in North America. But I don't see that the whole "it can't be turned off" is something that's like actually modified so much in the, at least I feel like it's not. I don't have the technical data in front of me to look at that. Starlink's basically an Ethernet system. It's a radio system, but it hands off between satellites. It sounds to me like they struck a deal. That's the DoD is going to absorb any of the liability in that aspect, would be my guess. That's my 2 cents worth when it comes to that. So we'll give it back to you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I know when the report was they can't be turned off, but I understood that since Starlink retains the system control, they can probably be turned off, but perhaps not in a targeted way. So when you say they struck a deal, I appreciate that's realistically what happened. Exit, go ahead.
And just for the record, in that CNN video they had of the newest version of the USVs, Ukrainian USVs, it did still look like it had some version of a Starlink receiver on it. So I would presume that maybe a portion of these are specifically for that. And coincidentally, there is a new report just 20 minutes ago of another USV attack, possibly in Novorossiysk, which I probably just screwed up the name of. But anyways, so that's 3 reported attacks in the last week, which is a really interesting escalation from Ukraine on that side and something to watch. But the reason I raised my hand is that I think it's really interesting that the Trembita is focused, their development is focused on also providing a cheap bait version. And I will be interested to watch missile production, like the traditional missile production, going forward, to see if maybe they piggyback on that idea as well. Because I could see how that would have some benefits for just dealing with air defense and all the other reasons that Ukraine is using it right now. And it'd be interesting to see if this kind of influences the traditional missile production as we go forward. But I imagine that's something we won't know for a number of years, probably.
Well, it will also be interesting if Ukraine does deploy significant numbers of decoy cruise missiles. You'd think that Russia would want to copy that tactic pretty quickly, which, given, a few months ago, there was particular concern about the availability of Ukraine's air defense munitions, might present a bit of a challenge to them. And Exit, if you have a tweet about that potential USV attack, feel free to add it to the nest. And just everybody with breaking news, take everything with a grain of salt. If it was in fact a USV attack on Novorossiysk, that would be very interesting, because for those who don't know, that base is the Russian naval base that's on the far northeastern side of the Black Sea. And there had been talk about the route USVs had been taking to attack Sevastopol, which is dramatically closer, and speculation about how big those USVs were in terms of fuel capacity to make that trip. If they're attacking Novorossiysk, either they're super long endurance or they're coming from somewhere else. So there's lots to unravel in that attack. Nick, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Please, I was only able to join very recently, so if this is not germane to the discussion tonight, or if it was already covered, please forgive me. It's been weeks since I've heard much about the Ka-52 alligators that the Russians have been deploying and losing. And I'm curious if it's just because I haven't been able to be as attentive to podcasts and spaces that I haven't heard about many losses lately of these helicopters, or of their continued deleterious effects on the Ukrainian forces working their way through all the minefield belts. So if anyone has any info that might be germane to my question, I'd love to hear it. And if that's inappropriate at this point, I understand and thank you.
Yeah, if anybody has specific figures at hand. Oh, Colby's hand went up immediately. I before going to Colby, I will say that I have continued to hear that Russian helicopters continue to be a concern for the Ukrainians. I also have heard about the downing of Ka-52s every couple of days. So I think essentially they continue, they're still a problem, but they're still being lost at a surprisingly high rate. But Colby may have more specifics.
I don't know what the most recent Ka-52 loss was or when it happened. I'm just trying to check Oryx right now to see if I can find that. It looks like over a week ago, July 25th. So somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, if there's been one since then. But it would seem that for Oryx, that's the last one that was actually destroyed. The Russians most certainly continue to use them. I know I saw some new pictures today, I believe, that were posted from the Russians on social media, showing Ka-52 being loaded up with the typical loadout of unguided rockets and the Vikir anti-tank guided missile, which is the main system that's making it so potent and challenging for the Ukrainians, because that has about a 10-kilometer range, which is fairly far and limits Ukraine's ability to destroy them when they're firing at that sort of range. There's a limited number of short-range air defense systems that they have that can potentially strike back at those distances. So that's the challenge with the Ka-52. That still, there needs to be more SHORAD given to the Ukrainians to help address that challenge.
Yeah, I just
thank you.
I just had a quick look at Nalcio, who's been doing a breakdown of losses just for the counteroffensive. His last update on that was July 28th, so almost a week ago. At that point, he only had one Russian helicopter loss during the counteroffensive. And so I could swear that I had heard about more Ka-52s being destroyed, like as in 2 or 3. But I also know that Oryx's system, they only count battle losses, and perhaps one of the ones I had heard about was, like a training accident back in Russia, but I can't back that up with a source at the moment. Okay, so I'm thinking that we have maybe 15-20 minutes left. I did want to touch on a few items with regard to Russian forces, but I may do a bit of a speed run in referencing them. But, if this inspires any comments, I do still welcome them. So I've put the 3 sort of blocks of material for Russian forces up in the nest. They're the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. And I just wanted to highlight, or some of the things I wanted to highlight include that there have been a number of Russian arson attacks recently, particularly against recruiting centers. And so you'll see if you have a look under arson attacks mapped, a map that was put together. There have been something like 25 or 26 attacks against recruiting centers just in the last month, and it's pretty spread out across the country. The second item up there is under the phrase arsons versus mobilization. This one I'm going to break out individually. I thought this was interesting. Alexander Jokic found this, but it's from Mediazona, noting that there was a massive spike in arsons against recruiting centers just prior to the last announcement of mobilizations. It's not necessarily because of cause and effect. It may just be the populace starting to get nervous that leads to this. But again, there's been this massive spike in the last week. Interestingly, there are a lot of those who have been arrested for the arson attacks have claimed that they have been tricked into it by phone calls. Everything from people saying that they're FSB agents and that the folks at the local recruiting center are corrupt and that they need these people to carry out an arson attack in order to smoke out the corruption, to people who are almost being blackmailed. And they say, in order to have us give up the blackmail material, you need to attack a local recruiting center. And so it's these reports of the people carrying out the attacks being essentially coerced into it or tricked into it are very unusual, and I'm not really sure what to make of them. Other figures relating to Russian forces, there are continuing reports that Russia is attempting to recruit nationals outside of Russia. So particularly they're placing online ads in an attempt to recruit citizens of Kazakhstan, even though under Kazakhstan's laws, it's illegal for their citizens to go to fight for another nation. And that some Kazakhstanis have actually been convicted after having fought for Russia and been sentenced to jail. So that was interesting. And then there was also a claim that came out from the Ukrainian government estimating that in total so far, between 55,000 and 60,000 Ukrainian citizens in the occupied territories have been mobilized by the Russians. And so that was one of the first times I've seen a number put on that. If right at the bottom of that tweet, you'll see the phrase training ground analysis. And this is a thread from Tatarigami, who is I believe somebody told me he's a Ukrainian reserve officer. And he did an analysis using imagery of Russian training camps to try to get a sense of how full are they, are they very active? Do they have significant equipment at them? And his conclusion was that many of the training camps he looked at were very active, and he didn't see any apparent lack of vehicles or equipment for training purposes, saying that, so in his conclusion, he said that while there are claims that Russia may be running low on vehicles, it's not apparent from the training, and it's, likely training centers would be some of those stripped first, suggesting that there are still plenty of, modern tanks available to the Russians. Jacoby, go ahead.
Just going back to the items you mentioned about arson at the mobilization centers or the recruitment centers. I read a number of those articles or posts, and interesting that these sort of incredible claims of coercion seem supported in any credible way from they all seem to be very similar out into the open when people were detained. I found that to be very interesting.
Okay, I think I got most of your point there. Just so you know, Jacoby, you were breaking up a little bit, but I agree with you that the claims that they're being coerced into it are in some cases hard to believe. If I missed any more of that, then you may need to cycle down and come back up. But you're welcome to phrase the question again if you do cycle. One or two more points on Russian forces. If you have a look at the fourth item back in the nest, again, I'm just going to speak to these points rather than break them out individually. Sorry, just bringing her back. Yep. Okay. So included in here, the first item is a tweet from Rob Lee. He's noting that there were posts that were put out by Russian mill bloggers claiming to be messages from VDV soldiers talking about how several of their commanders had been removed, how they were very frustrated. They named the generals Selivyurtsov and Kornev as having been removed. This came after the removal of Popov, who I believe was a colonel, and it looks like Popov was definitely removed because there's audio of him being critical of the fact that his complaints were not answered. But now it's appearing that these other people who were named in the Telegram claims, Selivyurtsov, for example, he's now appeared in some footage, appearing to still be in command. And so it looks like some of those details of the claims were not correct. So we just wanted to highlight that because we did speak about the claims at the time that they were made. The second item down was intriguing, although I don't know what to make of it. Igor Gherkin, or Igor Strelkov, who for quite a long time had been given a free hand to voice criticism of the way that the war was being conducted. We spoke a little over a week ago about his having been arrested for, denouncing the Russian military. Apparently now, there's an article here by Medusa that's linked. His case has been classified so that further details will not be made public. Which is very intriguing to me. I assume that may just be to avoid embarrassment, but it makes me raise my eyebrows a little bit. The last item in this tweet that I'm going to highlight was a claim from a nuclear policy agency that said that Russia has apparently reached out and stated that it would be willing to remove the nuclear weapons that it has deployed to Belarus if the U.S. were to agree to remove its nuclear weapons from Western Europe and Turkey. Now, that's probably just an off-the-cuff diplomatic suggestion, but it was, very interesting to me that they seemed to be willing to play with the idea of reversing the deployment to Belarus. I presume the comment was only made because they knew their demands were completely unrealistic. And so it's probably more political posturing, but I still thought it was interesting that it was even raised. The last set of material on Russian forces is the fifth tweet back in the nest. And this is primarily about continued provision of parts to Russia for the manufacture of weapon systems. So you'll see several sources here that talk about provision of electronic parts in some detail. It made several headlines when it was discovered that the engine in a Lancet drone was made by a Czech company. Apparently, people have reached out to that Czech company and they have said they haven't actually manufactured that particular model of engine for a year. Although it does look like some back stocks are still available for sale. And this has led lots of people to say, is it impossible to enforce dual use sanctions? because it seems like there are just constant leaks of these parts to Russia. And it's also raised the idea of, is there an increasing need to apply secondary sanctions to these countries that are appear to be intentionally increasing their purchase of systems that Russia requires and then re-exporting them to Russia. And I know that over the last few months, there apparently have been several quiet conversations where it's alleged that the Americans had threatened that if there isn't an improvement on some of these issues, they may consider secondary sanctions against countries like Kazakhstan. But we certainly haven't seen any of them, any application of secondary sanctions, other than some that have been applied to Belarus, partly because of its more direct role. There was also an announcement about China introducing some export controls on the export of various drone systems. But I heard for those of you who know Fain, Fain covers a lot of commercial drone matters. And so in last night's space with Sam Bendett, she was speaking to the details of these export controls and said that they apply to larger drone systems and would likely not apply to drone systems on the size of those manufactured by DJI. And so it's unlikely to stop the provision of, frames and parts and so on to Russia, which Russia appears to have been relying on for its FPV drones. Okay, I wanted to touch on, maybe I'll go another 10 minutes. Let's see, what do I want to cover here? I'm going to quickly run through a couple of Wagner points, and then we'll see if I can touch on one or two very high-level points regarding the Black Sea, the activities in the Black Sea. So again, I'm going to speak to these as blocks rather than breaking out the individual items. So if you want to follow along, you will have to look at the items as they appear in the nest. So the first item that's up there, it's just populating at the moment. It speaks to Wagner's continued activity, and so they're continuing to sorry, I'm just finding my place because it hadn't populated yet. Yes, okay. So the first item here is an article written by the account All Eyes on Wagner, who does great work tracking them and reporting on them here on Twitter. This article, it's in French, but it's, if you follow the matter closely, it's worth auto-translating. And it goes into, given their reduced role in the war in Ukraine, are they still worth tracking? And, they make several points, including that they will continue to have a significant role in Africa, but also that they've committed so many crimes that continuing to understand how they're operating and where they're located will be important in ultimately attempting to hold the leaders of Wagner accountable. There's a note that I didn't include all the flight tracks because there have been so many, but Prigozhin has flown back across from Belarus to Russia 2 or 3 times just in the last few days. So it seems like he's really not being limited in his exile to Belarus, which is interesting, especially when taken together with the fact that it appears that his Concord catering group has been awarded several Ministry of Defense contracts or Russian government contracts, including after the Wagner revolt. And so given that they were trying to part ways, and shut down all of those deals, it looks like it's unclear whether that it's sort of bureaucratic and accidental that contracts that were in process were completed and entered into, or whether the Russian government is still open to funding Wagner in some low-level way via continued contracts. And then finally, in sort of the general cover of Wagner, you will see in this tweet that also the United Kingdom had been reported to be very close to declaring Wagner a terrorist entity. And then this article came out from the UK Times saying that now there are suggestions that there are legal problems ever since Putin came out and made it clear that Wagner was almost completely funded by the Russian government, in that declaring them to be a terrorist entity would essentially now be declaring the Russian government a terrorist entity. And apparently that's not a position that the UK wants to take. And so the reports are that their inclination to make that designation has been put on hold. The second tweet in the nest goes to developments with regard to Wagner in Belarus. And so the Belarusian Hagen Project is following them closely. They note that now something like 14 Wagner convoys have arrived. Last I saw, they were reporting that the number of personnel was more than 3,500. And that was when there were 10 or 11 convoys. So I suspect it should be well over 4,000 by now. There's a tweet here where the Hagen Project saw significant construction at the base that Wagner is located at in terms of digging trenches. And their belief is that they're not fortifications, but that they're training trenches. And apparently they specifically noted that these trenches included ovens and the like. And so it appears that they're being built at this point for continued use through the winter for training purposes. Then there's a little block in here about back and forth about how much of a threat Wagner in Belarus may offer to Poland, where the Polish prime minister came out and said that Wagner may assist migrants in crossing into Polish territory, but then if they're sneaking through migrants, that some Wagner personnel may attempt to infiltrate Polish territory as well. But interestingly, the United States has come out with a different position. So you'll see in this thread, I say that the U.S. position on the threat to NATO, it's an article by the Kiev Independent where the White House spokesperson came out and said they believe that the Wagner Group poses no direct threat to NATO, which seems to be, the United States trying to take the temperature down a little bit following the Polish comments. However, as the last point in that tweet, under the heading Wagner attack as Russian attack, you'll see in the tweet from Patrick Fox that the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations has come out and said that an attack by the Wagner Group on a NATO country would be treated as an attack by the Russian Federation on NATO. So even though they're saying Wagner is not believed to be a threat to NATO, they're being very clear that Russia shouldn't try to distance itself from Wagner and use it as a proxy, because they will take that as a direct attack by Russia. Okay, probably I'll make this the last point, and maybe we'll save developments in the Black Sea for Sunday's conversation. So that just means that Sunday will be, Black Sea plus developments in Africa as our major themes. So these last points I'll speak to are in the third tweet back in the nest on updates on Wagner's activities in Africa. So the first point is that Wagner is continuing to recruit in Africa. You can see the tweet here by Georgi Revishvili on that front. There was an interesting article highlighted by Jack Margolin. It was put together by Vox, but it makes the argument that Wagner's operations in Africa, so there's lots of discussion of the fact that they're involved in gold mining and they may be involved in trade in illegal diamonds. But the argument is that, in fact, Wagner's operations in Africa aren't particularly profitable, and that the majority of Wagner's revenue instead came from the Russian government, suggesting that their purpose in Africa is more to act as a destabilizing force for Russian diplomatic ends, and that it's not really a standalone profitable enterprise. And so the argument's made in the Vox article, but interestingly, Jack Margolin, who follows Wagner very closely, is saying that this is a point that he's been trying.
Lost him, unfortunately.
I'm sorry, am I not coming through?
I will just take a quick moment to point out that also Sunday, I think we're having a special guest. Jacoby, you might want to give people a teaser about that.
Exit. I think you're not being heard. You're being heard by everybody else, but you're not hearing other people. Sorry. Really sure what you said though. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, sorry, I just shot her a message in case she lost connectivity, or like all of us. Oh, okay. We'll get that resolved. So sorry, I was just on my last points there, just saying that Jack Margolin had highlighted that he also agrees that Wagner operations in Africa are not particularly profitable in and of themselves, which, I think is very interesting if true, suggesting that without, if the Kremlin regarded them as being expendable, then it would be very difficult for them to try to struggle to maintain their operations simply on the profitability of the enterprises that they've set up down there. And then maybe the last 2 points are 2 different reports if you want to track Wagner's recent movements and where they may be headed. So on recent movements, there's an article by the
I think we might have lost Michael there for a minute, but I will take a minute to let people know about the guests that we'll have in the conversation that we're going to have on Sunday. We'll have Stephen who works with War Translated, who's very steeped in reading Russian sourcing and taking a look at their messaging, and is particularly interested in the various different ways in which Russia employs propaganda, both externally, internally, how it's different, and its effect on people both externally and internally in very different ways. And in relation to that, some other people among us who have had experiences with disinformation and misinformation in what they've been following, just as Stephen encounters it. So that should be a very hopefully an interesting discussion, and also a conversation from, as Michael alluded to it earlier, developments in Africa, going back a little bit for some context, and then taking a look at what's been going on in the last couple of weeks. So please do stay tuned for that if you are interested in either of those 2 items on Sunday at 4 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time.
Yeah, thanks for covering there. Sorry, guys. I'm sure you can appreciate how frustrating it is to have to reset right at the end there. But that's just Twitter keeping me humble. So my last point was just to note that on that Wagner front, there was also an article from RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, entitled Where Next for Wagner in Africa, and they often have great insights. So you may want to check that out. Again, that's in what's now the 5th item back in the nest. And so further to Jacoby's point about the great folks that we're trying to get in to speak with us on Sunday, I've now put up in the nest a link to the invitation for that. So set your reminders now. And also just a reminder that friends of ours do stream our conversations to YouTube. And so if you miss our talks and you want to catch up, do have a look at that YouTube account. It's now the second item. There's a link to that YouTube channel as the second item back in the nest. And so I think with that, I'm going to wrap up. Just a reminder that there is a bunch of material we didn't get to on, diplomacy and humanitarian issues, economic issues. You can always go to the thread to read the material if you just want to catch up and see what we thought was important. You could click on any of those first couple of items in the nest, and that will take you to the thread to check it out on your own time. So I guess with that, I'll just say thanks very much, everybody, for joining us tonight. I think we had some great conversations about, equipment and about, drone strikes near Romania and Belarusian helicopter overflights of Poland and so on. And so many thanks to everybody who came up to speak with us. I think that many of those speakers have been following the war for its entirety, and I would encourage you to check out their profiles and consider giving them a follow. And I guess finally, I'd like to thank my co-host tonight, Exit and Jacoby. Without your help, it would be extremely hard to run these conversations. So I hope that I can see you guys all on Sunday afternoon, 4 o'clock. And for now, have a great night.